Soldier's Heart by Alex 51324. Chapter 28. November 1917 to April 1918. Rollins hung about the rest of the day, mucking in with the dressing changes and everything, and in between chores, Thomas filled him in on the operations of the house. "It's lighter work than the hospital, really," Thomas admitted. "But what that means is whenever we're short-handed, which is always lately, we've got to take the brunt of it." He explained the night duty arrangements, adding, "The last few nights I've been on-called with one of the new men on duty. I'm lucky if I have time to fall asleep before he wakes me up again, wanting to know if so-and-so can have an extra morphine tablet, or if 98.7 is a fever, or how to find a sauce with both hands on the map." "Typical," Rollins said with a chuckle. "Yeah, keep laughing. Griff's got it from tomorrow night, the Cyclops, and then you're next, Saturday to Monday." "Oof," Rollins said. "I just got here." "That's why I didn't stick you with it tomorrow," Thomas informed him. Rollins slumped into one of the armchairs. "Not a lot of advantage in being the Wardmaster's best mate, is there?" "Nope," said Thomas. "Remember Corporal Jessup?" Rollins thought for a moment. "Oh, fuck, I'm in for it, aren't I?" "Well, you don't have to take the new men on their first visit to the front line," Thomas said, making a mental note to give Rollins the language lecture later. "So that's something." "Too right," Rollins said. He propped his artificial foot up on the opposite knee, making some adjustment to the straps that held it on. Thomas supposed it gave him more trouble than he cared to admit, much as Thomas didn't care to discuss his shoulder. "Can't complain about anything, really, this far to the rear." "Well, we can," Thomas pointed out. "Doesn't change anything is all." There was too much to do to make time for that drink Rollins had asked about, but when the day shift were setting up the hall for tomorrow's breakfast and handing over their cases to the night men, the last tasks before they finished for the day, Thomas suggested Rollins stay to dinner. "There's a few more things to go over, and then we can have that drink if you like." Rollins agreed readily. It had happened before that one of the orderlies worked late and had his dinner in the servants' hall, so Thomas didn't expect Rollins's presence to be all that remarkable. But he had not reckoned for certain people's insatiable appetite for anything to do with his personal life. No sooner had they sat down than Miss Hughes said, "Harper, am I right in thinking that you know Sergeant Barrow from the war?" "Yes," Rollins said. "From the 47th. We were in the same billet." Bates said. "The infamous barn." So Rollins told them all about the barn, and they lapped it up as though Thomas hadn't even written them about it. Perhaps they not believed him. When Rollins had finished describing it, with detours into the cat and the personalities of their old billet mates, Miss Hughes said, "Well, I hope your billet here is more satisfactory." "It is. They put me up with a Mr. and Mrs. Entwistle. I haven't met him yet, or the chap I'll be rooming with, but the landlady gave me a nice lunch when I stopped in to leave my kit." "You remember Wiggins, then?" Thomas said. He had mentioned Miss Entwistle's cooking before. "You'll get on all right with him." "Good," said Rollins. "Are there sons?" Thomas had no idea, but Miss Hughes said, "The elder one was killed, I'm afraid. The younger was in Italy, the last I'd heard." They went on to pepper Rollins with so many questions, a few about his recent circumstances, but mostly about his time in France. Thomas found he had to answer a few of them himself just to give Rollins time to eat a bite or two. Mercifully, Rollins did not volunteer the hand story, but he did talk about what had happened when Thomas first got his corporal's stripes. "So he'd been our corporal about 10 minutes. We were still figuring out where we were going to go to get him drunk, when he tells us we're getting up early the next day for uniform inspections and drill. We all just about you could have knocked us over with a feather." "I told you why," Thomas pointed out, suspecting that the others would not find this story as hilarious as Rollins did. Bates was already giving him an exasperated look. "You did," Rollins acknowledged and continued. "So we got up the next day so hungover we could barely stand up, and there we were doing drill." Thomas thought it had been the next day when they'd gone out drinking, but didn't argue the point. "I was no better off than the rest of you, and I had to run drill," he said. "Yes, and we all thought he'd gone off his rocker," Rollins continued. The rest of them looked like they thought that too, but at least Thomas knew how this story ended. "I believe 'mad with power' was the phrase," he interjected dryly. We didn't think that, Rollins admitted to the others. He went on to explain how Thomas had run them ragged over the next few days. And we still had our regular duties, don't forget, until they reported to their new posting at the casualty clearing station, only to find that they were being inspected immediately. Besides us, the platoon was one other section from an advanced unit and 2 straight from training camp. So of course the new men were all spit and polish, but the other section was basically a shambles, and the CO tore them up. We didn't come off too badly though, and when we're going back inside, somebody says how it turned out lucky that Barrow was riding us like he did the last few days, and the Barrow says... Here Rollins turned to Thomas, and he dutifully filled in. That was why we were doing it in the first place. Luck had nothing to do with it. Carson, Thomas noticed, gave him a startled, sort of appraising look. Right, Rollins said, turning back to the rest of them. Turns out the wardmaster tipped him off about the CEO where we were going, was a stickler for that sort of thing. I told you, Thomas said again for the benefit of the listeners. It wasn't a secret. He did, Rollins confirmed. But you know what he's like. He just sort of slipped it in between 2 other things and we weren't really paying attention. Thomas didn't think they did know that about him, but Anna nodded thoughtfully. You should have been, Thomas said. 10 minutes you were our corporal, Rollins reminded him. We hadn't worked out yet. We were supposed to hang on your every word. I hadn't worked out yet. I had to club you lot over the head first if I was going to say anything important, Thomas retorted. There now, you see, Miss Hughes said when she and Mr. Carson retired to his pantry for an after-dinner sherry. Here's a word, chum, and he's staying in the village. Nothing to worry about. At tea that afternoon, Miss O'Brien had asked, with a butter-wouldn't-melt expression, whether Mr. Carson thought it quite suitable for Thomas to bring his friend to the house. Mr. Carson had wanted to call Thomas in for an immediate interrogation on the subject, but Miss Hughes had managed to convince him to let her ask the questions under the guise of ordinary conversation. I'm not sure I go that far, Carson said darkly. She waited to hear if he had some specific objection. She worried that it might eventually dawn on him that Corporal Rollins being a war chum did not necessarily preclude him also being one of Thomas's sort, but none came. Well, I, for one, am glad Thomas has someone to help him supervise the other men, she said to shift the subject. They've been running him ragged, especially this business where we had to sleep in his office in case the man on night duty ran into a situation he couldn't handle. It was, he said, only a few nights at a time, but she could always tell which ones it was, from the way he came to breakfast looking as though he hadn't slept at all. It seems everyone is short-handed now, Mr. Carson said. Have there been any more applicants for Ethel's replacement? None satisfactory, Miss Hughes answered. Well, she was in fact more worried about what would become of the girl and her unborn child than about the problem of filling her job. She allowed herself to be drawn into commiserating on the difficulty of finding staff these days. So, Mr. Bates said when he and Anna were waiting at the servants' hall table for his lordship and the ladies to ring for them. Thomas has a friend. I suppose so, Anna said. At least Corporal Rollins had claimed to be, but Anna wouldn't have guessed it from the way they spoke to each other. They seem to quarrel a lot. Miss O'Brien, who was likewise waiting for her ladyship to ring, said, Like an old-mannered couple, if you ask me. No one did, Mr. Bates pointed out. To Anna, he continued, That's normal, though, with army chums. You don't get sentimental about it. Not unless you've been drinking. Sometimes you'll see 2 chaps insulting each other and you can't tell whether they're best mates or somebody's about to be punched in the face. He thought for a moment. Or sometimes they're best mates and still punch one another in the face. Men, Anna thought, were sometimes very strange. Still, this insight served her well when a day or 2 later she happened to overhear Corporal Rollins telling some of the other orderlies a gruesome story involving a severed hand and concluding with, And that's why we called him the Magnificent Bastard. Between Mr. Bates's explanation and the orderly's reaction, Anna grasped that this was, despite appearances, a high compliment, which she couldn't help wondering how Thomas felt about it, particularly given that, as he told her once, he actually was. Thomas did seem a bit less frazzled now that Corporal Rollins had arrived. From what Anna had seen of Thomas at work, he seemed to spend a lot of time rushing from place to place, checking on this or overseeing that, and it had only gotten worse when so many of the orderlies left and were replaced by new ones that Thomas claimed needed watching every second. Corporal Rollins apparently could be trusted to shoulder some of that load, giving Thomas some room to breathe. The other orderlies spent most of their time upstairs, either about their duties or in the rooms set aside for them, but Rollins quickly became as much of a presence downstairs as Thomas himself was. Even though he didn't live there, he always seemed to be around. He made frequent appearances in the servants' hall for breakfast and dinner, a circumstance that Thomas explained by saying he was on night duty or they had NCO business to discuss, despite the fact that no one was asking. Almost no one, at any rate. The rest of them ignored Miss O'Brien's sly remarks, mostly made out of Thomas's hearing, but there was no denying that what she was hinting at had crossed all of their minds at one time or another. Because with Corporal Rollins around, Thomas was almost happy. He told jokes and allowed himself to be teased and engaged in what was, for Thomas, a startling amount of affectionate roughhousing. They could barely be within arm's reach of each other for 2 minutes before they were punching each other in the arm or knocking their shoulders together or, on a couple of occasions, actually play wrestling. Anna had seen enough hall boys and footmen pass through the house to know that it was the sort of thing that boys did. But not Thomas. He was the cat that walked by himself, and nobody ever touched him. Except for Mr. Fitzroy, who'd been very, very circumspect about it, and now Corporal Rollins, who at times put Anna in mind of an exuberant puppy. Apart from that difference, though, she did notice a certain similarity to Mr. Fitzroy, not in their looks so much, but in their easy manner with other people and the way they drew Thomas out of himself. Anna wasn't sure if he was a particular friend, in the sense that Mr. Fitzroy had been, but he seemed to be good for Thomas in some of the same ways. So while Anna would never have asked the question aloud, she would admit privately to a certain curiosity. She tried giving him opportunities to talk about Corporal Rollins if he wanted, but his response to her first effort, asking why he hadn't mentioned his friend was coming, was, "Had it sorted, didn't I?" He didn't, she recalled, entirely understand that people sometimes told things to one another without expecting to get something out of it. She also tried asking how he and Corporal Rollins had become friends, but Corporal Rollins had shown up just then, eliminating any chance of a serious answer. After a brief shoving match for space on the crate, they both insisted on sitting on to smoke, even though there were several others available. Thomas had said, "How'd we get to be mates, you wanted to know?" "Not sure, really. He just sort of hung around, like a stray dog." "Oi!" Corporal Rollins said and shoved him. One evening, when Corporal Rollins came down early to dinner, ahead of Thomas that was, and there weren't too many others in the servants' hall, she saw an opportunity to get him talking. Sitting next to him, she said, "Are you settling in well, then?" "Oh, sure," he said. "Bit of a change from France, but I don't mind getting used to the quiet again." "Do you miss it?" she asked. "I think Sergeant Barrow did." "Yeah, he actually sort of liked it over there, I think. Man, bugger," he said fondly. "I miss our mates, of course, but most of them are gone by now anyway. Transfers, I mean, some of them." He took out his cigarettes. "Do you mind if I—" At her nod, he lit one and continued. "I miss the old days, I suppose, before 1st July. 1st July, Anna knew, meant that date in 1916, what had become known as the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the day Thomas had been shot, among other things. She was wondering whether to ask about that. Thomas still hadn't told them much about the day he'd been wounded, when Rollins continued, "But I suppose when those old days were happening, I missed the old days before Lamb was killed." "Lamb?" Anna asked. "Yeah, Lamble," Corporal Rollins said, as if she ought to know who that was. "The bloke from our billet who was killed our first summer over there." "I don't think he mentioned it," Anna said uncertainly. "He must have," Corporal Rollins said. "It was when he got put up to Lance Corporal." He looked at her searchingly. "The thing with Diggs?" Anna frowned. "He said he was made Lance Corporal over something to do with linen. I'm not sure of the details." Had Thomas made that up? Well, Corporal Rollins said, "Oh, right, that was the first time. I forgot about that one. That was only for a couple of weeks, but the next time he got put up, it stuck. That was, it's not a very nice story, actually," he said apologetically. I don't suppose it would be if it's about somebody being killed, she pointed out. True, he thought for a moment. Lamb was the first one of us to die. From our billet, our section, the bunch of us that went over in the first half of 15. However you want to figure it, none of us actually liked him very much. Barrow will be the first to tell you that. But he was one of us, so it shook us up. Naturally, Anna said, only Thomas hadn't breathed a word about it. It was a pretty bad night. Nothing compared to the next summer, but worse than anything we'd seen yet. We were on Barrow duty, bringing the wounded back from the front. I was in an ambulance, which wasn't too bad, but a few of us, Barrow, Lamb, some of the others, had to carry them back through the trenches to the road. Since they were the new lads, they were paired up with our corporals. Regular army blokes mostly, at that time. They were supposed to look out for them. There were those words again. Look out for them. But they didn't? She asked. Most of them did. Barrow had Jessup, real steady chap. Lamb had Corporal Diggs, who was... Not, Anna suggested. It might be a little unworthy of her, but she was glad Thomas had had someone looking out for him. Not, Rollins agreed with a grateful air. He was a friendly sort. I mean, nobody disliked him much before that night. Barrow might have, because it was Diggs who stuck him with the linen job, and Barrow doesn't care much whether anyone's friendly or not. But anyway, they were carrying stretchers back and forth, and somehow, nobody saw this part, so nobody knows how, Lamb ended up out in no man's land, fetching a casualty with one of the casualty's friends, while Diggs sat on his arse, pardon my language. Mr. Bates joined them then, and Anna explained in a murmur what Corporal Rollins was telling her about. Once he'd been brought up to date, Rollins continued, The new lads weren't even supposed to go up over the parapet, let alone on their own. That's the hardest bit, getting them back to the trench from no man's land, and none of us had done it yet. They weren't going to make us do it the first time on a night like that. So this Diggs, you didn't stop him from going? Anna asked. Worse than that, Rollins said grimly. They were shelled. Shrapnel shell, I think. The casualty and the other infantrymen were killed instantly, but Lamb was still alive. And Corporal Diggs wouldn't go out after him. Mr. Bates swore under his breath. So Corporal Jessup got wind of it somehow and went up there to try to talk some sense into him. He refused, even after Jessup told him it was cowardice in the face of the enemy. So Barrow went with him instead. You mean, Anna said uncertainly. Over the top, Rollins confirmed. Barrow's good in no man's land, but nobody knew that yet. He didn't even know it. Anna wondered how much time Thomas had spent in no man's land, but before she could ask, Corporal Rollins continued. They got Lamb back in, but he died later that night. By the day, Diggs was He was in disgrace, and Barrow was a lance corporal. Diggs ended up losing his stripes and getting FP, but Jessup told me later, this was after Barrow was gone, when I got put up to corporal, that if Barrow hadn't stepped up, they'd probably have had to shoot Diggs. Pour encourager les autres. I'm surprised they didn't anyway, Mr. Bates said. Corporal Rollins shrugged. He and Jessup and the wardmaster were all old pals from South Africa, apparently. Anyway, we all thought Barrow was pretty swank before that, but after? Thomas himself joined them just in time to catch the tail end of Corporal Rollins' remark. Please say you're not telling them the one about the hand just before dinner, he said, giving Corporal Rollins a shove as he dropped into the chair next to him. Here's the one about Private Lamble and Corporal Diggs, Mr. Bates said. Thomas scoffed. Not sure that's much better. Anna, having heard part of the one about the hand, disagreed. That one was much less suitable for pre-dinner conversation. You never mentioned you were a war hero. That's because I'm not, Thomas said, lighting a cigarette. What did you tell them? He asked Corporal Rollins suspiciously. Just what happened, Corporal Rollins said. As much as any of us know, anyway. To Anna, he added, I reckon the only reason you told me anything was that I was at the collecting post when they all turned up. That's right, Thomas said. Wasn't quite in my right mind then. Not that he told me much, Corporal Rollins added. I got most of it from Jessup. Yeah? Thomas asked. Did he tell you the bit where after we put him down I was shaking so bad I couldn't light a cigarette? He told me the bit where you held it together long enough to finish the job, Corporal Rollins answered. The rest of them started coming in then, so the talk turned to lighter subjects, but Anna found her thoughts returning to the story Corporal Rollins had told. It explained a great deal, she thought, about Thomas's newfound obsession with looking out for people. He'd seen Corporal Biggs fail in that duty. Fail spectacularly, she gathered from Corporal Rollins and Mr. Bates's reactions, and fall into disgrace because of it. With his own rise so immediately connected to Diggs' downfall, it was little wonder it made a strong impression on him. After the blood grouping drive, a success, they barreled straight into preparations for Christmas. The previous year's celebration had been muted, war-weary as they all were, but now that Downton was an army medical facility, there was a patriotic obligation to make everything as festive as possible for the wounded officers. The Abbey's usual grand Christmas tree was set up in the main hall, delivered by Mr. Bassett and Lang, who Thomas was pleased to see looking well, and decorated by those of the patients who were physically able. Miss Patmore threw herself into holiday baking, inspired perhaps by intimations that the current voluntary rationing scheme would soon become mandatory, and the orderlies and VADs alike took to lingering downstairs in hopes of being able to volunteer to taste test the latest batch. Lady Grantham fretted a great deal about the idea of Christmas presents for the patients. Most, she explained at some length to Thomas and Major Clarkson, would have gifts sent to them from home, but they couldn't be sure that all would, and they couldn't possibly have anyone left out. It would be too dreadfully expensive for the Abbey to arrange something for everyone, but there was no way to know who'd be left without, and beyond that, it could seem pointed if some received gifts from their hostess and some did not. Thomas struggled mightily to care about this crisis, and was relieved when Lady Edith proposed a solution. The officers could draw names from a hat, and each arrange a gift for their fellow patient they drew. That way everyone would get something, and the only cost to the household would be in Lady Edith's time, because she would organize it, of course, and do the actual shopping on behalf of those who weren't able to go into the village. It seemed like a lot of fuss to Thomas, and likely to result in people wasting money on gifts the recipients didn't even want. But he certainly wasn't going to argue about it with his betters, and all complaining about it in the orderly's room got him was Rollins quoting Dickens at him. In the end, most of the patients seemed to enjoy it, whispering like a bunch of schoolgirls about who'd drawn whose name and what they were giving them. Last year, the orderly's Christmas tea had consisted of a fairly grim plum pudding supplied by the woman who cooked for the hospital, but this year Rollins explained to them that the correct procedure was for everyone to contribute some of the contents of their parcels from home to make a communal, festive spread in the orderly's room. Thomas, fearing more Dickens, bought a large box of biscuits to contribute, only to have Daisy suddenly, a day or two before Christmas, hand him a fruitcake he was apparently supposed to have been expecting. "What's this?" he asked, looking at it. "A fruitcake?" she said. "Obviously, what am I doing with it?" "For the orderly's tea," she said. "It's 7 o'clock in the morning," he pointed out, not to mention it wasn't his job to take the orderly's tea up. "Not today's tea," she said. "The Christmas tea. Percy said everyone was bringing things from their parcels." Oh, that made a certain kind of sense, but who's Percy? Daisy gave him an exasperated look. "Corporal Rollins." Rollins's name was Percy! Thomas decided to cherish this information as it was the only Christmas present he was likely to get. In that too, however, he proved to be mistaken. The afternoon post brought a largish and rather heavy parcel from France, with army postmarks. Thomas suspected a Christmas gift from one of the old crowd. It was about the right size to be a German helmet, for instance, and was considering putting it in his bottom desk drawer where he'd stowed the fruitcake to open on the day, when it occurred to him that there was nothing other than the date of its arrival to suggest that the package had anything to do with Christmas at all. It could be, for all he knew, some bit of personal property he'd left behind somewhere, or worse, that Peter had. The personal effects Peter'd left at his last billet had eventually been sent to Downton as the last known address of his next of kin. If something else had turned up, presumably they'd send it here too. So he opened it. Inside were a number of trench newspapers wrapped around a familiar bottle of Armagnac. The enclosed note read, "TB. Thought you'd better have this for your office now you're ward master. Hope you're getting along all right up there. Things here about the same. One bit of good news, we got your mate Rouse in the last round of transfers. He managed to get out of being sent to the PBI on account of he's a short arse. Sharp enough to cut himself, that one, but if the war goes on long enough, I'll knock some common sense into him. Miss you, son. Crossed out. Jessup says to tell you he misses you, but you and I both know you're better off out of this shit show. W.T. Thomas hadn't quite managed to swallow down the lump in his throat when Rollins came in. Hey, have you seen... Is that... Woolmaster's private stock? Thomas confirmed, stowing it in his bottom drawer. Keep your mouth shut about it. I'm not putting it out for the Christmas tea. No, Rollins said. That's good stuff. He had me into his office for a drink after we saw you off. Yeah? Thomas asked. Did he give you the now you're a corporal lecture? I think that was the idea, but he was pretty gutted, sending you away like that. I didn't like it much either, Thomas admitted. I remember, but now I've seen this place, I think you must have been mad. Knowing there was no way he could explain to Rollins how very much he had not wanted to come back to this place, he said instead, Didn't know how it was all going to turn out, did I? Could have ended up as one of Sister Crawley's scarecrows. The ward sister's grander plans for the crippled ex-soldiers hadn't borne fruit, at least not yet, but a horde of them turned up twice a week in the village for a free meal. Don't say that, Rollins objected. There was also no way to explain that it had been a very real possibility, or that the danger hadn't passed. Thomas changed the subject. On Christmas Day, there was a great deal of extra work to do. Not only did the patients have to be gotten down to church and back up again, but quite a number of them had visitors, all of whom seemed to need to be personally assured that their sons, brothers, husbands, or fiancés were eating enough and being kept warm. But most of the visitors left after tea time, and then Lady Edith organized the patients in charades and other parlor games, allowing the orderlies to have their own tea in relative peace. In addition to the usual things, and the spread they'd put on out of everyone's parcels, Lady Grantham had supplied a large box of Christmas crackers, so there was a fair bit of silliness involving paper hats and the reading of mottos and the swapping of prizes. One thing to be said for all the excitement was that it tired the patients out, so most of them were happy to make an early night of it. Once the night shift came on, Thomas left them in charge of the few patients who were still awake and retired to his office with Rollins to open the wardmaster's armagnac. While Thomas was setting up the glasses, Rollins rather sheepishly tossed him a small, squashy sort of package, saying, Here, your mother made you this. It's probably a scarf. She's not much of a knitter. It was socks, rather lumpy ones. That was nice of her, Thomas said uncertainly. I told her it's not really the done thing to give one's sergeant presents from one's mother, Rollins explained, but she insisted. Thanks, Thomas said. Now he supposed he was going to have to write her a note. Setting the sacks aside, he poured their drinks and handed one to Rollins. Happy Christmas, he said, raising his. Happy Christmas, Rollins echoed. They drank and settled into the armchairs by the fire. Hard to believe it's the 4th Christmas of the war. Was it? In some ways, it seemed like only a short time ago that he and Peter and Anna and... What was her name? Liesel, that was it. That they were in Kew Gardens having ice cream and champagne. In others, it seemed as though the war had been going on for decades. But Thomas just said, Too right. Lighting a cigarette, he asked idly, What did you do last year at the 47th? Rollins looked sheepish again. You're going to laugh, he warned. Well, now I've got to know. We made a stocking for Mittens, Rollins confessed. He was right, Thomas did laugh. Let me guess. Plank's idea? Rollins nodded. He made him a toy mouse out of a sock. Thomas could almost picture it. You're daft. You know that. I know, but it was sort of fun. We all got up a bit early and pretended like he was excited to see what Father Christmas had brought him. Good God! Thomas laughed again, shaking his head. What did Father Christmas bring him, besides the sock mouse? Couple of cans of sardines, a collar with a bell on it, stuff like that. Colin's got some cat mitts somewhere. I think that was his favourite. Rollins went on talking about the cat's Christmas presents, and it was all very silly. Honestly, that had to be the most spoiled cat on the Western Front. But still, Thomas sort of wished he had been there. Early in the new year, Miss Hughes asked Thomas if he could go into Ripon with her. What for? Thomas asked. With a glance up and down the downstairs corridor, she drew him into her sitting room. I took Ethel some things at Christmas. Food and some warm clothing and such. she sighed.
She'd found some way of making ends meet, but now that her condition is starting to show, that's gone. So I said I'd take her some more food, but the street where she's living is...
She trailed off.
I'd feel better having a man along, and that's a fact.
Thomas agreed, and they settled on Sunday afternoon as a time when they could both get away discreetly. Mr. Carson apparently didn't know about this errand of mercy, and Miss Hughes wanted to keep it that way. Miss Hughes, it turned out, was not being at all precious about Ethel's new situation. From a cramped and dirty street where grimy, ill-clad children played in the gutters, they passed through a dank, urine-scented tunnel into a class of shabby houses, staring at one another through curtainless windows. To get to Ethel's door, they had to pass by a knot of men in rough, dirty clothes.
It's a bed-sitting room, she said, so perhaps you'd best wait. I'll just be a moment.
Given a choice between standing out here and otherwise, Thomas wasn't sure that he wouldn't rather risk seeing Ethel's underthings hung up to dry. But since Miss Hughes wasn't giving him a choice, he nodded curtly and handed Miss Hughes the basket of provisions. Once the door had opened a crack to admit her, he lit a cigarette, more to imply some sort of reason he was standing about than anything else. He had a sneaking suspicion of just what it was that Ethel had been doing to make ends meet, and it wasn't long before his suspicions met with some corroborating evidence. One of the doors opposite opened, and a woman stepped out. Hair untidy, blouse a bit too low, skirt a little too short. One of the men made a desultory sort of catcall, which the woman ignored. Picking her way through the litter and piles of slush adorning the street, the woman approached Thomas, essayed a coquettish smile, and said, "You looking for company, Tommy?" Thomas was keenly aware that the men were watching, and that whatever he said was bound to be a source of amusement to them. Finally, he settled on, "No, thank you." As expected, the men laughed nastily. As the woman made her way back across the street, one of the men said, "You're too old for him, love."
"That's not it!"
the woman yelled back. By the time Miss Hughes came out, Thomas had smoked his way through 3 cigarettes and watched the tart successfully solicit another man who turned up in uniform and looking furtive.
"I'm sorry to have kept you waiting," she said. "The poor girl. Well, she hasn't anyone to talk to about her troubles."
"Oh, no problem. I was just out here fending off prostitutes." "It's fine." But when Miss Hughes asked him again a week or 2 later, Thomas told her he wasn't waiting outside.
"Very well," she said. "Miss Crawley wishes to speak to her, so we really must have a man."
Thomas suspected that the toughs would peg Miss Crawley instantly as a middle-class woman doing good works and wouldn't trouble her, but didn't argue. This time they went on a weekday morning, so the grimy urchins were not in evidence. These days, even filthy urchins went to school, at least until they were old enough to work, and there was only one man standing at the mouth of the ginnel, keeping a watch for the filth, Thomas suspected. Miss Crawley did at least manage to appear unfazed by the scene, apart from a slight narrowing of her lips. Miss Hughes again knocked on the door, and they were admitted to a dark and narrow front hall with peeling, damp-stained wallpaper and a number of battered wooden doors, each equipped with a sturdy lock. Miss Hughes knew the way and led the party up a dingy, unlit staircase, while Ethel brought up the rear. Ethel's room was larger than Thomas would have guessed, but very sparsely furnished, with only an untidy bed and 2 wooden chairs. A layer of grime covered everything, and the small stove barely took the chill off the air. Ethel didn't take off her coat, an old one of Miss Hughes that didn't quite meet over her swollen belly, but nor did the rest of them.
"I'm sorry for the mess,"
she said, taking the basket from Miss Hughes and beginning to unpack it.
"Please, sit."
Miss Hughes and Miss Crawley took the 2 chairs, so Thomas, for lack of a better option, posted himself by the door, and then mentally recited the Lord's Prayer, followed by the multiplication tables, as Miss Crawley proceeded to ask Ethel several technical questions regarding her pregnancy. He only stopped when Miss Crawley's tone changed from questioning to steamrolling. When he picked the thread back up, she was saying,
"Know that there are places for girls in your situation." "I won't go to the workhouse if that's what you mean,"
Ethel interjected, her jaw set stubbornly.
"Not at all," Miss Crawley said. "I was able to secure you a place at a maternity home for unwed mothers. A former colleague of mine is matron there, and she assures me that the girls are very well looked after. medical care, proper nutrition, and comfortable hygienic surroundings.
Here Miss Crawley glanced around the room, which was not at all comfortable or hygienic.
Most importantly, when you're ready to leave, you'll be supplied with a reference to enable you to find respectable employment.
To Thomas, it sounded almost too good to be true, even considering the part Miss Crawley had mentioned yet. He watched hope war with suspicion on Ethel's pinched face.
How's that? She asked. What kind of a reference? The residents do most of the work to keep the home going and prepare layettes for the babies, so they'll be able to describe the work they've seen you do,
Miss Crawley explained.
The matron writes them very carefully to avoid any untruth but give the impression you've been employed at a small lying-in hospital. That way you'll be able to put all of this behind you.
It didn't take Ethel long to see the catch.
But how will I explain the baby?
Miss Crawley hesitated slightly.
The babies are placed in suitable homes with couples who are desperate for a child but unable to have their own. No, Ethel interrupted. I won't give up my child to be raised by strangers.
Nodding, Miss Crawley said sympathetically.
The girls do find it very difficult. It's one of the reasons matron has them make the layettes, so that they can send their babies off with something they made with their own hands. And the parents are very carefully selected. The matron interviews each couple at length. They must provide references from their family doctor and a member of clergy, and they must demonstrate that they have the means to provide materially for the child. I don't care, Ethel said defiantly. A child needs its mother.
She folded her arms protectively over her belly.
Ethel, Miss Hughes said sharply, Miss Crawley has gone to some trouble to help you. You'll not be rude to her.
Miss Crawley smiled tightly.
It's all right. I understand that this is difficult for you to accept, Ethel, but you can't go on like this. The way that you're living now isn't healthy for you or the baby. I'll manage, Ethel said firmly.
Or petulantly. Thomas wasn't sure.
You aren't managing, Miss Hughes said flatly, and it will only get worse once the baby is born.
Miss Crawley jumped in.
Where do you intend to have the baby? Here? Who will help you?
Ethel sniffed and looked away.
There's a woman up the street who delivers babies. I've put aside the money to pay her. Does this woman have medical training? Miss Crawley asked. She knows what she's doing, Ethel said. The girls say she delivers all of the babies hereabouts, and she doesn't ask nosy questions.
That, Thomas thought, was probably true. In their line of work, Ethel's neighbors would need the services of a woman like that.
At the home, you'll be attended by a trained nurse experienced in midwifery, with a doctor on call should anything go wrong, Miss Crawley said. Surely you can see that's better. Except they take my baby away, Ethel said. To a better life, Miss Hughes said. What kind of a future do you think you can give the child? How will you support it? I've thought about that, Ethel said. I'll find a place where I can have the baby with me. A small house where they can't be too picky.
She wasn't out living in a dream world, was she? But the next part of the fantasy was, if anything, even more improbable.
She hurried on. All I need is a reference that explains everything. You can write it, Miss Hughes. Just say that I left service to marry a soldier, only now I've written you that he's been killed, so I have to go back to work.
Miss Hughes drew her breath in sharply.
I most certainly cannot, she said. I'm sorry, but if I write a false character for you, the character of every girl who's worked at Downton Abbey will be suspect. You've broken the rules, my girl, and I won't pretend you haven't. I've broken the rules, Ethel exclaimed. What about him? She jerked her chin in Thomas's direction. You won't know what he's like, and it's worse than anything I've done.
Oh, you bitch, Thomas thought. But in the back of his mind he knew that were their positions reversed. He out on the street for being a sod, and she, the unrepentant slut, will come back with open arms. He'd have said the same thing. Miss Crawley looked at him with a quizzical expression, but before she could ask the obvious question, Miss Hughes said, How dare you? Sergeant Barrow has done everything he can to help you. Not quite everything. In Ethel's place, Thomas's next move would be a blackmail demand, but she likely didn't know any more than Miss Hughes did that there was in fact one thing he could do which would change everything. As Thomas had very good reason to know, a woman's husband was the legal father of her child, no matter how soon after the marriage the birth took place. Marry me, or I'll tell, she could say. Except, Thomas realized with relief, What could she tell? The police wouldn't be at all interested in her story. He hadn't actually done anything illegal since before the war, unless kissing counted, and she didn't have a shred of proof that he ever had. Nor would the army, for the same reason. And as she said, everyone at Downton already knew. Well, apart from Miss Crawley, anyway. As she was the bridge between the household and the hospital, where they most definitely did not know, her finding out could make things a bit uncomfortable. More than a bit, really. But not enough that he'd shackle himself to Ethel, of all people, for life just to avoid it. While Thomas thought about this, Miss Hughes went on remonstrating with Ethel, saying how she'd no one to blame but herself for her situation. Not true, Thomas noted absently. There was one other person to blame, and if she had any sense, she'd be grateful for the help that was offered and not demand the moon.
But I suppose if you had any sense, you'd not be in this mess to begin with,
Miss Hughes concluded. Ethel was taking short, shuddering breaths, very obviously trying not to cry. Thomas thought of Major Bryant saying, "What I got up to with a round-heeled housemaid," and Philip saying, "Who'd believe the word of a greedy footman?" "It isn't right that you're ruined and the Major gets off scot-free." The women all looked at him. "Nothing any of us can do about it, but it isn't right." Silence stretched for a moment until Miss Hughes sighed.
"No, I suppose it isn't, but it's the way of the world."
The steamroller started up again.
"You needn't be ruined if you do the sensible thing,"
she pointed out. Ethel, her composure now restored, repeated her arguments against giving up the baby. She and Miss Crawley went round on the subject again until Miss Hughes observed that they'd need to hurry if they were to catch the bus back to Downton Village. Miss Crawley rummaged in her handbag and produced a leaflet.
"I'll leave this with you," she said. "It's some information on the maternity home. It's intended for donors, but it should give you something to think about."
Or something to light the fire with, at least. Ethel looked at it sullenly for a moment before snatching it out of Miss Crawley's hand.
"But I wouldn't think too long," she added. "The matron won't hold your place forever. Write to Miss Hughes as soon as you've made up your mind, and we can make the arrangements."
They ended up reaching the bus stop just in time to see the bus leaving, and after a brief discussion, retreated inside a shabby but respectable tea shop to await the next one. Once they'd all been given cups of weak and over-sweetened tea, Miss Crawley asked,
"Sergeant, what did Ethel mean? We all know about you."
Bloody hell, Thomas had been hoping she'd forgotten about that. He looked to Miss Hughes in hope of some plausible answer, but she only pressed her lips together. Finally, he said, "That I'm illegitimate, I expect." As an explanation, it was slightly more acceptable for discussing in a public place than the real one.
"Oh," Miss Crawley said. "Oh, I see. Well, now I understand why you've taken an interest in her situation."
Thomas hadn't actually thought of it that way, but now she mentioned it, it might be part of it. He said and sipped his tea. Miss Crawley sipped hers as well and recovered enough to say,
"Perhaps you could, another time, help Ethel to understand the effects for the child. I'm sure you agree that adoption by a respectable couple is the best choice."
Thomas wasn't entirely sure of that, really. It would improve the child's prospects in life, certainly. He wasn't stupid enough to not realize that he'd have been a great deal worse off if he hadn't appeared to have a father. "If they really can't have their own, I suppose," he said. The kid would never know anything different as long as it didn't have brothers and sisters who were their parents' real children.
"That's one of the reasons they require a reference from a doctor," Miss Crawley said. "Apparently a lot of the girls worry that the adoptive parents just want someone to work for free."
Thomas hadn't thought of that, but then there had to be easier ways of getting a cheap worker than starting with a helpless infant. Miss Hughes went on to ask a few questions about the unwed mother's home and how adopting couples were chosen, and Miss Crawley's lengthy answers carried them through until the next bus arrived. On the way back, Thomas found his thoughts returning to the options Ethel had before her. It was too bad that she hadn't been quick enough on the jump to trick another man into marrying her. From the questions he'd tried not to listen to, he gathered that she must have already been in the family way when she'd been sacked from Downton. If she'd just managed to sleep with Griff before she left... Well, it was far too late for that now. Finding anyone stupid enough to marry her when she was obviously carrying another man's child was even less likely than finding a place in service with a baby in tow. Honestly, she must think she lived in fairyland. Thomas remembered lies he'd been told about running away to Paris or a Greek island. He remembered believing them once or twice. He remembered convincing him that he believed them after that. Ethel was about the age he'd been then. If she was fantasizing, she might as well imagine something good. A man falling madly in love with her and agreeing to give the kid his name. Maybe he'd lost his Todger in the war. That happened sometimes. Mustard gas, usually. They didn't often live, but what the hell? Say he had. Say further that he'd always wanted to be a father, but he thought that dream was dead until the chance meeting with a heavily pregnant daughter. Not even Ethel was dumb enough to imagine rubbish like that. They got off the bus in Downton Village, Sister Crawley heading to the hospital, Thomas and Miss Hughes up the lane to the house. As they walked, Miss Hughes said,
"I don't suppose it's any of my business, but what you told Miss Crawley."
Thomas glanced over at her. He'd sort of assumed Anna would have told her at some point. "It's true. It's why I don't work at Barrow & Sons Fine Clocks. She married him later."
"Oh," she said, "he must have been a very good man to have married a woman with a past like that."
"No, she tricked him into it." He looked straight ahead. "I don't really enjoy talking about it."
"I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't pry."
"No, you shouldn't." "I couldn't exactly tell him about the other thing."
"I'm surprised Ethel brought that up,"
Miss Hughes noted. "I'm not. She's proper cornered."
"Well, yes, but I don't see what that has to do with anything."
Miss Hughes, Thomas reflected, would be utterly unfamiliar with the specific misery that was seeing someone else get the mercy neither of you deserved. "I do," he said. They walked on for a moment, their feet crunching in the gravel of the drive. "Wonder if she'll think of blackmailing me."
"I should hope not."
He shrugged. "She won't get very far without evidence," he said. Miss Hughes gave him a look he couldn't read and shook her head.
"And apparently he's expecting Ethel to blackmail him now,"
Miss Hughes added. Anna was perhaps less surprised than Miss Hughes was by this information. She was familiar with Thomas's habit of considering blackmail as a solution to life's problems. Miss Hughes had invited her into her sitting room to tell her how Ethel was faring, but had veered off into Thomas's revelation, new to Miss Hughes, that he was illegitimate. He had, she gathered, given Miss Hughes a more abbreviated version of the story than he told her.
"I doubt she'll think of it,"
she said. Ethel and Thomas did have some things in common, but that wasn't one of them.
"He only said that you wouldn't get far without evidence. I hope that means he's being careful."
It wasn't the first time that Miss Hughes had made a remark that hinted in the direction of speculation about Thomas's friendship with Corporal Rollins. "I expect he is," she said. She was inclined to think that had there been anything going on, there would be a great deal more discreet. Likely Corporal Rollins was completely unaware that there was anything to be discreet about. She only hoped that Thomas didn't get his heart broken. If anyone wasn't wondering about Corporal Rollins on their own, Miss O'Brien put the idea into their heads. She didn't say much in Thomas's hearing. Perhaps Mr. Carson's forced retreat had inspired some caution in her, but she wasn't in the habit of looking over her shoulder before letting loose with a cutting remark, and it was perhaps inevitable that she'd eventually slip up. It was almost spring by the time she did. Thomas was late to dinner, and Mr. Carson had also left the table, having been summoned up to the small library to deal with some crisis or other. Daisy came into the servants' hall to ask if she ought to put a plate in the oven for Thomas.
"I expect he'll be back any minute," Anna said. "He was only going down to the village for a pint."
The RAMC men often went to the pub after their shift, and while Thomas hadn't been in the habit of joining them before, he now sometimes, with a great show of reluctance, allowed Corporal Rollins to drag him down there. "Or so he says," Miss O'Brien noted. "I only hope he doesn't bring his fancy man back with him. Turns my stomach the way they carry on." They were all trying to avoid looking at each other as they did when Miss O'Brien said something like that when Thomas stepped into the room. "I beg your pardon, Miss O'Brien," he said silkily, his version of her butter-wouldn't-melt voice, as he went round the table to his place. "Just what is it you're suggesting?" If he hoped to fluster her, he had miscalculated. Miss O'Brien tilted her head inquisitively, then tittered. "Did you think you were fooling anyone?" she asked. "You and your army pal." Thomas's face went completely blank, wiped of all expression. "You're mistaken," he said flatly. Miss O'Brien scoffed. "We all know," she said. "Don't try—"
"That's enough, Miss O'Brien," Miss Hughes said sharply. "Anna, pass me his plate, please."
Anna did so, and Thomas slipped into the seat beside her, jaw clenched. He was not actually shaking, but she somehow had the sense of a kettle with the lid clamped on too tightly at full boil. Miss Hughes passed him a generous serving of stew and dumplings, but he barely picked at it. Mr. Carson returned and, either oblivious to the atmosphere or doing a very good job of pretending to be, explained to them that his lordship had gone to fix himself an after-dinner whiskey and found the decanter nearly empty.
"I very much fear that leaving it out has proven too tempting for one of the hospital people."
Thomas didn't rise to this bait, and gradually normal conversation resumed. Once she judged that everyone else was sufficiently distracted, she said, "Thomas?" She'd only meant to ask him some innocent question, if he'd had a nice time at the pub or something like that. But he turned to her with a look of such intense fury that she fell silent. As soon as Mr. Carson and Miss Hughes had gone out, he bolted for the courtyard. Anna waited a moment or two, and then with some trepidation followed. She looked for him on his usual crate, but found him instead pacing angrily. "Is that what you all think?" he demanded. "Thomas, is it?" She sighed. "Most of us don't think it's any of our business." He huffed and inhaled deeply on his cigarette, and thought he might be building up to say something particularly scathing or profane, but instead he blew the smoke out slowly and said quietly, "He isn't. He's normal." "All right," she said. "Does he know?" "No," Thomas snapped, "and he isn't going to." If that was how he wanted it, Anna hoped he was right. Miss O'Brien wouldn't go that far, surely. "So I'm not allowed friends now, am I?" Thomas thought, pacing the courtyard as he smoked another angry cigarette. "Or is it that they think nobody could possibly like me if I wasn't sleeping with him? Just bloody marvelous, either way. Fucking fantastic!" In the back of his mind, Thomas knew he wasn't being fair. He ought to have put a stop to Rollins pawing at him. Ought to have put a stop to it back when it started in France, and at the very latest when it came to Downton. He couldn't pretend to be surprised what people thought about it. Except that if Rollins really was like him, he'd know better than to carry on like that. Not that the rest of them had any right to go speculating about his private life. What, did they talk about it every time his back was turned? "We don't think it's any of our business," Anna had said. Ha! It wasn't, but there was no denying they were all obsessed with every detail of who might be pairing off with whom upstairs and down. That they felt the need to pretend otherwise when it came to him only proved what they really thought. That he was a freak, a degenerate, couldn't be spoken about above a whisper. But he had to be grateful for that too, because if it were any different, Rollins would find out. Hell, he might anyway. Thomas had walked in on some of their careless chit-chat. What was to stop Rollins from doing the same? Or any of the men, for that matter. He ought to have run the other way when the subject of the convalescent home first came up, or quashed it somehow. He must have been mad, mixing his two lives like that and thinking his secret would stay a secret. One thing he could say for his men, they wouldn't believe it easily. Not of the magnificent bastard. Everyone knew men of that sort were weak, and Rollins had told enough tales of his deeds at the front to make the story hard to swallow. But if the question were raised, well, Thomas never quite knew how it was that people could tell, so he couldn't exactly do anything about it, could he? The best thing might be to create some convincing evidence to the contrary. A girl in the village, though how you went about getting a girl to walk out with you he didn't know. It was almost too bad that Ethel wasn't bright enough to try to blackmail him into marrying her. A married bloke wasn't entirely above suspicion, but one who'd had to marry his girl in a hurry? He had to be normal. It really would be the perfect alibi. Not that the thought of marrying somebody, passing for normal, hadn't occurred to him before, but he never thought he could fool the girl. And a wife finding out you were carrying on with other blokes behind her back was a good way to end up in prison. But Ethel, well, she already knew, and she wasn't in any position to cast stones. The illusion of respectability would help them both, really. But she'd never think of it. It wasn't until he was lighting his third cigarette that it occurred to him that she didn't have to. She was still stalling Sister Crawley on an answer to the maternity home plan, still getting food from Miss Hughes every week. He could suggest it. She'd almost have to agree. They could, after the war, go someplace nobody knew them and pretend to be a respectable family. It might be sort of nice, having a kid. It wasn't likely he'd be a great dad, but he wouldn't be any worse than his own so-called father. And it certainly would serve Mr. Barrow right to have his name given to another fatherless bastard. He went to sleep imagining scenarios in which he could find himself in Barrow and Sons' fine claques announcing that fact. By morning, sanity had reasserted itself. Rollins didn't suspect anything, nor did any of the others. If O'Brien did say anything that required an explanation, he could simply, and truthfully, say that she was a vindictive bitch who was out to get him. And as for the other part, well, he knew perfectly well how miserable two unhappily married people could make each other, and if he ever started to forget, he had the Bateses to look at as an example. Bates's private detective had succeeded in getting photographs of the adulterous couple, but so far not in identifying Mrs. Bates' partner in crime. If it were Anna, for instance, or Daisy, it might work, but Ethel was... well, when you got down to it, she was too much like him. Before her downfall, she'd had the same conviction he once had of being meant for a better life than scraping along, and while she might be grateful at first for being rescued from her current impossible situation, it wouldn't last. They'd be lucky to make it a year or two before they were at each other's throats. And besides all that, he didn't have any idea how he was going to support himself once the war was over, let alone a wife and baby. So all round, it was probably the stupidest idea he'd ever had. But still, at idle moments, he found his thoughts returning to the idea of being a dad. Carrying a little daughter on his shoulders, or teaching a son to bowl a cricket ball. Telling bedtime stories about working in a grand house, as his mother had done for him, or mending their toys when they broke them. Ethel was absent from these fantasies, except as a vague background figure who packed picnics and waved them off on adventures. Not that the real Ethel would do anything of the kind. Once or twice he imagined himself as that nice widower doing his best with his little boy, or girl, but he put a stop to those imaginings out of a sort of superstitious caution. Though now he'd thought it once, if she really did die in childbirth, he'd always sort of wonder if he'd made it happen. It was a bit of a relief when Ethel agreed at last to go to the maternity home. She was by then about to pop, and the day after she gave her consent, Miss Crawley had her loaded onto a train. Now we didn't have to worry about her, or about the baby, or, most importantly, about him doing anything stupid. It really was for the best, he thought, as Miss Crawley told him she'd had a telegram from her friend the matron saying Ethel had arrived safely. After all, he'd been able to imagine thinking of the baby as his own, and he wasn't even a particularly nice person. That was a reason to think that the father in a carefully selected adopting couple, desperate for a child, would be able to manage it in real life. And Ethel, well, she'd get over it.
"There you are," Rollins said, taking out his cigarettes as he went to sit next to Barrow on their smoking crate outside the back door. "Hello," Barrow said and moved to another crate. He'd done that a few times lately, and every time he did it, Rollins remembered him shouting, "Don't you know that I come out here to get away from you?" He'd been telling himself that since he knew what it looked like when Barrow was angry with him, that couldn't be what was happening now. But he wasn't really sure. "Sorry," he said. "Did you come out here to be alone?" Barrow glanced at him. "No," he said, taking a quick pull from his cigarette. "I've my own room here. I don't need to freeze my bollocks off if I want a moment's peace." It wasn't freezing out. It was one of those warmish days you sometimes got in early spring, and Rollins suspected Barrow was remembering France as well. "Right," he said vaguely. "I'm just a grumpy bastard, you know that," he added. "Right," Rollins repeated, and if Barrow had been sitting next to him, he'd have knocked their shoulders together. But he wasn't. "Something wrong?" Barrow asked. "No," he said. There was, really. Well, not wrong exactly, but something he wouldn't have minded talking about. He'd had a letter from his father, who was convinced the war would end any minute now. He had a bee in his bonnet that the German offensives going on right now were a sort of last gasp before they gave up. and was full of plans for what would come after. Specifically, Rollins' future role at the paper factory his father ran. Now that Rollins had experience running a military unit, father said, he ought to be ready to pull his socks up and take on some real responsibility at the factory. Rollins sort of wanted to tell him that it was Barrow running the unit, not him. And if father thought that was a relevant qualification, maybe he ought to offer Barrow the job. But father would think he'd lost his mind, and Barrow wouldn't take it much better. He'd think Rollins was being a condescending bounce, and he'd probably be right. Instead, he asked, "What are you grumpy about? The war news?" Despite what father thought, the current news wasn't particularly good. Now the Russians had left the war, the Germans could throw everything they had left at the Western Front. They'd managed a couple of minor breakthroughs in the Fifth Army areas. "Not really," Barrow said. He started to say something else, then took a pull from his cigarette instead. "You remember Major Bryant?" "Sort of." He'd left not long after Rollins had arrived, and since he'd been pretty much recovered, hadn't really needed any medical care. "He got one of the housemaids up the spout," Barrow said. Rollins' eyes widened. "Who?" Not Barrow's friend, Anna, certainly. She was almost but not quite engaged to that older man, Mr. Bates. "She left before you came," Barrow said. "Got tossed out, really, because of that." "Oh, I was thinking about... Well, never mind." Something occurred to Rollins. "Did you like her?" Barrow never really talked about girls, not the way everyone else did anyway. That was all right with Rollins. He got along fine with girls and figured he'd marry one eventually, but he didn't entirely understand the magnetic fascination that the entire sex had for most chaps. "No," Barrow said. "Well, a bit, suppose. Maybe. I've just been thinking about how she got a raw deal." "Oh." It was, Rollins thought, the sort of thing he'd have talked about with Rouse instead if Rouse had been to here. The sort of thing they'd both think he was too middle class to really understand. Maybe he was. He couldn't imagine anyone else he knew feeling sorry for a girl like that. "What'll happen to her?" "She's all right, really. The ward sister got her into a place for girls in that situation. They'll look after her until the baby's born, then adopt it out." "That doesn't sound too bad," Rollins said. "Yeah," Barrow said. "It's the only way, really. It's just she's not keen on giving the baby up." Now that he thought about it, he supposed it wouldn't be. "Supposed to be a woman's highest duty, isn't it? Motherhood?" "Only if it happens in the right way," Barrow said, tossing his cigarette end down and stamping it out. "Hurry up and finish that. We've got work waiting for us." But he did stay, sitting there on the other crate until Rollins finished his cigarette, so Rollins supposed everything was all right between them. Thomas probably should have realized what the sound was as soon as he heard it. It wasn't as though he'd never heard a baby cry before. He could remember when Alice and James, his half-siblings, had been born. But thick as he was, he thought it was, he didn't know, an injured cat or something. He'd already started toward the sound when he heard something that clearly wasn't a cat. Shh, don't cry. The person was aiming for a comforting tone, but it sounded almost desperate. Thomas went round to the other side of the meat store, and there was Ethel, crouched with her back against the wall, holding a blanket-wrapped bundle. "Bloody hell!" he said. "Thomas!" Awkwardly she got to her feet. "You've got to help me! What are you doing here?" "They were going to take him away," she said. "I can't let them. I can't. I thought I could, but I can't." "Bloody buckery Christ! Running away from the Tots' home, you supposed he could understand, but why in God's name had you thought turning up here would help? Major Bryant's long gone. Not that he'd be any use if he weren't." "I know," she said, sniffling. "Can you get Miss Hughes?" "She's gone to bed. Ages ago. It was the middle of the night. The only person up was Prentice, who had night duty at the convalescent home. Thomas was meant to be sleeping in his office. He was on call again, but he felt restless." Ethel looked at him as though expecting him to suggest some alternative solution. He sighed. "Come on." Thomas led her through the sleeping house to his office, the only place he could plausibly claim to have any right to take an unexpected visitor, and put the kettle on. "Keep him quiet," he said. "If the patients wake up, we'll have a lot of explaining to do." Ethel nodded tightly. "Is there somewhere I can—" He waited in vain for her to finish the sentence. "Why, you can what?" She'd worked here. She knew where the labs were, so it couldn't be that. "Feed him?" Oh, Christ. Ducking back behind the linen shelves, he dragged one of his armchairs into the far corner and turned it to face the wall. I think that's the best we're going to do. I won't look. Ethel and the baby disappeared behind the shelves. Thomas did not look, but once the kettle had come to a boil and he took it off the flame, he couldn't help hearing the wet sucking sounds coming from back there. Finally, the sound stopped. There were more rustlings of clothing, and a moment later Ethel appeared red-faced. You should be all right for a bit now. Good, Thomas said. I made you some tea. He gestured to it, realizing as he did so that he couldn't quite see how she was going to drink it holding the baby. Do you want me to hold, him? No, she said quickly. I'll manage. She sat carefully shifting the baby into the crook of one arm to free up the other for drinking tea. The baby was very small, and the horrifying thought occurred to Thomas that he might have been just born. If he had, there could be, he didn't know, medical consequences of some kind for Ethel's flight. If that was even a possibility, he was going to summon the ward sister immediately, middle of the night or not. How old is he? 2 weeks, Ethel said, and Thomas breathed a sigh of relief. That had to be long enough for things to have, got back to normal. That's how long they let you keep them, she went on. They don't tell you, but I paid attention to what was happening with the other girls. Sometimes it's a day or two more, but I couldn't be sure, so I had to leave today. Had she been planning this the whole time? Go there, get the nutrition and medical care Sister Crawley had been banging on about, and then scupper. If she had, Thomas sort of admired her for it, but also sort of thought she was an idiot. So what's your plan? He asked. When she didn't answer, he pressed, You wanted Miss Hughes. What did you think she was going to do? Ethel rotated her teacup on the table. I don't know, she said, her voice small. I didn't. This was as far as I got. Wonderful. Just bloody wonderful. You can't stay here, he pointed out. Even if Miss Hughes wanted to let you, she couldn't without the family's approval, and you know they won't approve. I didn't know where else to come, she said. Most people, Thomas thought, would have asked about her family, but it wasn't likely, or even possible, that she hadn't thought of that. She'd have her reasons, and it didn't really matter what they were. Do you know anyone who isn't a servant? Anyone who has their own place and might take you in for a bit? She shook her head. Thomas ran through his own list. It certainly wasn't the sort of thing he could reach out to the wardmaster about, nor Lieutenant Courtenay, who was barely answering his letters anymore anyway. Nurse Crawley might want to help, but she couldn't do much without her parents finding out, and they'd skin Thomas alive for involving her in something like this. Unless maybe she could talk Branson into... No, we couldn't possibly keep a woman and a baby in his cottage without someone noticing, and also, if Ethel had any tatters of respectability remaining, cohabiting with a man would destroy them. Miss Crawley, he said. No! The sharp tone of Ethel's voice roused the baby, and she immediately moved to shush him. Once he was settled again, she said, She'll only take him away. She would certainly try. Can she? Thomas asked. Did you... He wasn't sure how these things worked. Sign your name to anything, saying you'd give up the baby? No, she said. They didn't ask me to. Do you think that matters? Her tone was hopeful. I don't know. Surely it would be kidnapping to take the baby away from her against her will. Wouldn't it? I don't have any other ideas. Maybe Miss Hughes will think of something, she said, and yawned hugely. With an internal sigh, Thomas pointed to the stretcher bed he was meant to be sleeping on. You might as well get a bit of rest. Be a couple of hours until anyone's up. When he made the offer, Thomas had thought he'd go get what sleep he could on one of the sofas in the recreation room, but it didn't take long for him to realize that if Prentice came looking for him and found instead a woman and a baby, there would be a human cry. He'd also be startled to find Thomas in here with a woman and a baby, but that was the sort of thing a bloke could understand the need to keep quiet. Thomas could figure out later how to answer the inevitable questions. So he passed what was left of the night in an armchair, the one Ethel hadn't used for baby-feeding purposes, and when the kitchen staff started getting up, he nipped downstairs and told Daisy to fetch Miss Hughes. What for? She asked. Never you mind, she'll understand once I've spoken to her. With a show of reluctance, Daisy went. It took almost a quarter of an hour for Miss Hughes to come downstairs, and the entire time Thomas worried that Ethel was about to be discovered. When she finally turned up, he said bluntly and without preamble, "Ethel's here." "What?" She looked toward her sitting room, but Thomas said, "She's in my office. I don't think it's a good idea to leave her alone that much longer. Anybody could find her." Fortunately, Miss Hughes grasped his point, and they started upstairs. As they went, she said,
"I knew that maternity home was too good to be true. I suppose they tossed her out as soon as they had their mitts on the baby, without any of what they promised."
filing away the cynical side of Miss Hughes for further investigation. Thomas said, not exactly. More the opposite, really."
"What do you mean?"
But by that time they had reached Thomas's office. He opened the door and silently pointed to Ethel still asleep on the stretcher bed with the baby on her chest.
"Oh, dear God,"
Miss Hughes said. Ethel startled awake, sitting up and looking about as if unsure where she was.
"Miss Hughes,"
she said, her voice sleep-roughened.
"you've got to help."
"I'll leave you to it," Thomas said. "Help yourself to tea, if you like." He withdrew. For lack of any better options, he went and helped the kitchen girls do the fires in the patients' rooms. By the time he'd worked his way around to the main ward, a apprentice, who was on duty at the desk there, said, "There you are. Miss Hughes said to tell you she's gone down to her sitting room." There was a hint of a question in his tone, but Thomas just said, "Thank you," and retreated to his office for a much-needed cup of tea and a cigarette. It wasn't long after that the day shifts started to trickle in, and from there the usual morning chores carried him along. As they were finishing morning dressing changes, Sister Crawley turned up.
"I'm afraid I have some alarming news," she said.
"Well, damn." "Yes, Mum?" Thomas asked, hoping it was something else. It wasn't.
"My friend who is matron at the maternity home telephoned," she explained. "It seems that Ethel has absconded with the baby. She hoped I might have some idea where she might have gone."
After a hasty weighing of the options, Thomas concluded that a lie on the subject would not go undetected for long and would cause more trouble for him than it was worth. "Yes, Mum," he said. "She turned up here a few hours ago."
"Thank heavens," Sister Crawley said, sighing with relief. "But why didn't you notify me immediately?"
"For one thing, it wasn't any of your business." "It was a bit too early, Mum, and there didn't seem to be any medical emergency. Miss Hughes took charge of her once she was up. Shall I take you to her?" Sister Crawley agreed, and as Thomas led her downstairs, said,
"The baby seemed all right? And Ethel?"
"Yes, Mum, as far as I could tell." So Ethel was an afterthought now. Typical. They were in Miss Hughes' sitting room. At the sight of Sister Crawley, Ethel got up from where she was sitting and retreated into the far corner of the room, holding the baby to her chest. "I won't give him up," she said. "I won't, and he can't make me." Sister Crawley took a deep breath, then glanced over at him.
"Thank you, Sergeant,"
she said. Before withdrawing, Thomas attempted to give Ethel a look which would say, "Sorry, this wasn't my idea. She just turned up." But it was rather a lot for a facial expression to communicate, and he didn't think he succeeded. Back upstairs, the other men had noticed that something out of the ordinary was afoot, and it wasn't long before Rollins turned up in Thomas's office to bump in for the details. Since he'd already told Rollins about Ethel, why he wasn't sure, he explained quickly, concluding, "Best let the women handle it." "Too right," Rollins said. "Why do you suppose she came here?" "I gather she didn't have any other ideas," Thomas said. Rollins didn't press the point, fortunately, and Thomas moved on. "Can you take on-call duty tonight? I didn't get much sleep with it turning up in the middle of the night." "Sure," Rollins said, also fortunately. Thomas could tell it was going to be a long day, but at least there was some end in sight. By midday, when Thomas's duties took him downstairs again, Miss Hughes's sitting room door was open and there was no sign of Ethel. Unfortunately, there were too many other people around for him to ask where she had gone, but it wasn't, after all, any of his business. Still, when he and Rollins went down to dinner, he hoped to find a moment to ask her. Sending Rollins ahead to the servants' hall, he checked her sitting room. Empty. He heard her voice coming from the kitchen and went that way, but she and Miss Patmore were standing over a brace of rabbit carcasses, having words. "Can't ask too many questions," Miss Patmore was saying.
"I understand about the shortages,"
Miss Hughes said tightly, "but—" Clearly not the moment for it. Thomas retreated into the servants' hall and promptly walked into the middle of another conversation. "Must say it's very broad-minded of you," Miss O'Brien was saying to Rollins. Oddly enough, the first thing Thomas thought was that she was making some reference to Ethel's situation. Although how O'Brien would know that Rollins knew about it, Thomas had no idea. Her next words proved otherwise. Him being the way he is, she went on, looking directly at Thomas. I should think most men would be worried about someone getting the wrong idea. Oh, you bitch! Thomas had been about to sit down, but now stood frozen in horror, his hand on the back of his chair. What were he is? Rollins asked, looking puzzled. Barrow, what's she? Nothing, Thomas said. Right, he'd expected something like this planned for it, though he hadn't expected her to try it in the middle of the servants' hall. What had he been planning to say? She's just being spiteful, like she is. That's right, Bates began, but O'Brien interrupted him, assuming an expression of concern. Oh, gracious me, she said. Do you mean you don't know? I never imagined you being such good friends. Or of course I wouldn't have said anything. Said anything about what? Rollins asked again. I don't think I should say, O'Brien said. Good, that was good. She'd shut up, and he'd think of something. Hell, he'd handled a situation like this once before with Sister Crawley. He'd pull Rollins aside after dinner and tell him about being an actual bastard. Thomas wasn't sure how he would take it, but it wouldn't be as bad as the other thing. It might even have worked if Anna hadn't decided to help. He's illegitimate, she blurted out. Everyone looked at her. Is he? O'Brien asked. What's all that about your father, the clockmaker? He was my stepfather, Thomas said shortly. He shouldn't have, saying anything only gave O'Brien a chance to make it plainer than she already had that it was a different matter she'd been referring to. And it really isn't a subject for the dinner table. My, O'Brien said. Aren't you just a Chinese puzzle box of dark secrets? When all attention was returned to her, she added, Not that the other one is much of a secret anymore. Except for Corporal Rollins, apparently. Rollins looked at him. Thomas took a deep breath. He was tempted to storm out, but it wasn't as though he could go far or anywhere Rollins wouldn't think to look for him. Can we talk about this later? He snapped. Sure, Rollins said, eyeing him warily. Carson and Miss Hughes came in about then, and not even O'Brien would keep picking at this subject in front of them, so that was all right. Except that Rollins would in fact expect him to talk about it later. Thomas spent most of the meal pushing his food around on his plate, trying to think of some way out of that conversation, either to avoid it or some lie he could tell, but whatever it was would have to be pretty damning. And if O'Brien caught wind of whatever it was, she'd find a way to make plain that that wasn't what she meant either. He could flat out refuse to say, but one of the others was bound to tell him, O'Brien herself, if the rest of them managed to control themselves. As the meal ended and they began going off to their various duties, O'Brien said to no one in particular, Oh dear, I hope it hasn't caused a rift between Sergeant Barrow and Corporal Rollins, after they've been so close. She wasn't fooling anyone, of course, but that wasn't the point. The point was that if there had ever been any hair's breadth of a chance that Rollins would forget about her insinuations or decide not to pursue them, he wouldn't now. That was vile, Mr. Bates said, sounding angrier than Anna had ever heard him. He had Miss O'Brien cornered at the foot of the stairs, and Anna hovered a short distance away, not sure whether she ought to stop Mr. Bates or join him. Miss O'Brien drew herself up. How was I to guess he didn't know? Come off it, Mr. Bates said. No one buys what you're peddling. All right, then, she said, unconcerned, or at least doing an excellent job of pretending she was. Perhaps I thought the poor man had a right to know. No one believes that either. Believe what you like, she smirked. There's nothing you can do about it. She was right. Just as they all knew Thomas was like he was, they all knew what O'Brien was like, with a possible exception of her ladyship at least. But being spiteful and vindictive wasn't a crime, nor was it even something they could report to her ladyship, particularly not given the subject about which Miss O'Brien had chosen to be spiteful. I'm watching you, Mr. Bates warned. Watch what you like as well, Miss O'Brien said. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've work to do in her ladyship's dressing room. With obvious reluctance, Mr. Bates stood aside just enough to let Miss O'Brien pass. Once she disappeared up the stairs, he asked Anna,
Where's Thomas gone?
He's outside with Corporal Rawlins.
Is he telling him?
Mr. Bates asked.
How should I know?
Anna asked back.
I don't see what choice he has.
Miss O'Brien had trapped him very neatly.
Nor do I,
Mr. Bates admitted. Glancing to either side, he asked,
What was that about him being illegitimate?
He told me a while ago,
she said.
Miss Hughes knows too. I shouldn't have mentioned it. I just thought... I'm not sure what I was thinking, really.
So, Rollins said once he and Barrow were sitting on two crates half facing one another. It was a pleasant warm evening, but he found himself thinking of sitting on the barracks steps in their greatcoats the winter they'd spent at the casualty clearing station. You really are, Barrow nodded curtly. I suppose magnificent bastard was a bit, That what Rollins wasn't sure. I wouldn't have said it if I'd known. No, Barrow said. That's all right. I thought it was funny, really. Besides, I'm not, technically. It's a bit complicated. My mother was married when I was born, but not when I was... He gestured vaguely. Oh, Rollins said, relieved. That's nothing too unusual. What is it they say? The first one comes any time, but after that they take 9 months. Barrow opened his mouth, but took a pull from his cigarette instead of speaking. Once he'd blown out the smoke, he said, Well, but it was a different bloke, was the problem. And he could count, so... He shook his head. He let everybody else think it was that sort of thing, but he knew differently. Oh, Rollins said again. Perhaps that was something Rouse would have understood better. The only things he could imagine a husband doing in that situation were either to cast his erring wife aside or, if he decided not to weather the scandal of divorce, take the knowledge to his grave. That Barrow knew meant his stepfather had done something else, but Rollins wasn't entirely sure what that would have been. Yeah, Barrow said. Not exactly a storybook childhood, but it could have been worse. Look at Ethel's poor brat. At least I had a name. Things rearranged themselves inside Rollins' head. So you're half-brother Fitzroy. He was on your real father's side? Rollins had assumed one or the other's father had died and their mother remarried. Except from the little Barrow said about him, he got the impression they hadn't known each other until they'd gone to work at the same house. That Lady Water was it. Barrow took a long pull from his cigarette and then another. After the smoke from the second had dissipated, he said, No. He took a deep breath. It wasn't my brother at all. He said it heavily, like it meant something more than he was saying, but Rollins wasn't sure what. Could it be the secret that Miss O'Brien had been hinting at? Rollins wasn't sure why someone would say a chap was his brother when he wasn't, but it didn't seem nearly bad enough for how everyone else had reacted, like she'd dropped a Mills bomb in the middle of the table. What was he then? This time Barrow took 3 pulls from his cigarette, stamped it out, and lit another before answering. My lover. Fitzroy had been a girl? No, that couldn't be right. Rouse had known him in the army, and this was modern times. A girl couldn't lie her way into the army in her brother's clothes when you had to be examined by a doctor first, so how could Fitzroy possibly have been... Oh. No, it couldn't be. You mean you're... Barrow looked away. That's a fucking corkscrew, yeah. That's... Rollins wasn't sure how to finish that sentence. Impossible? It wasn't likely Barrow would be saying it if it weren't true. Disgusting? Maybe. Illegal? Definitely, but Barrow hadn't already know that. Yeah, Barrow said, standing up. I'll just... And then he went inside, slamming the door behind him. Thomas felt a moment's idiotic hope when Rollins turned up in his office a little while after he'd left him in the courtyard. He said, do you still want me to cover... Of course, he was only there because Thomas had put him on duty. No, he said. Are you sure? Because I just go, Thomas said. Corporal. Rollins braced up and said, Sergeant, and left. It was just as well to have gotten that over with, Thomas thought. They both had to go on working here, for a bit at least. Next time they did the duty roster, he could tell Sister Crawley to put Rollins down at the hospital instead. say the walk was too much for him with his leg or something. That is, if Rollins had the sense, or the decency, to keep his mouth shut. Had O'Brien known what she was doing, maneuvering him into admitting it? A confession from his own mouth to a fellow NCO made his position with the army much more precarious. A mere rumor he could deny, but he couldn't tell their commanding officer Rollins was lying. Well, he could. Wouldn't, though. He just had to hope that making clear he understood their friendship was at an end would be enough for Rollins to let the matter drop. But of course there was no way to know whether it would or not, and nothing he could do to ensure the outcome. So it was another sleepless night in his office. Thomas was almost nostalgic for last night, when it had been someone else's problem keeping him awake. At least until the telephone rang, its shrill voice cracking the night wide open. Thomas's first thought, as he hurried to the front hall to answer it before it woke all the patients up, was, "Police!" But of course they didn't ring you up to say they were on their way to arrest you. His second thought, when it was Mr. Molesley on the other end, was Ethel. But that wasn't it either. "Miss Crawley's had a telegram," he said, and Thomas knew what that portended even before he added, "from the War Office." Thomas remembered her saying about comforting the wounded and dying. "I just think of my son." "What does she need?" "Well, Mr. Molesley said, "I'm not sure really. I thought his lordship ought to know, and perhaps some of the family. The ladies might be with her. She's bearing up all right so far, but—" "Right," Thomas said grimly. If it was the family he wanted, that meant waking Mr. Carson. He wouldn't be happy about it, but he wouldn't be happy about Thomas doing anything else, either. "I'll have them woken up and told. You're telephoning the hospital, I expect?" "Yes," he said. "Shall I stay here for one of them to ring back? I suppose I should, but I might be needed at the house, especially if some of the family are coming down. I just don't know." Thomas broke in on his dithering. "Tell one of the 9 duty orderlies what's happened, and that Sergeant Barrow says that to take a message to Sister Crawley's house if someone rings back for her. All right?" "Yes," Mr. Molesley said, sounding relieved. "Yes, that's sensible. I'll just—" Thomas hung up the instrument. By now, Prentice had appeared. Thomas gave him a quick précis of the situation. He knew the word sister, too, and said, "If any of the patients ask what's going on, it's a family emergency. Some of the family will be coming down, I think, but I'll see what I can do about keeping them quiet." Not that he'd actually be able to do much, but he'd try. Carson reacted about as well as one would expect to Thomas appearing in his bedroom in the middle of the night. "What the devil are you—" "Mr. Matthew's dead," he said. Carson sat bolt upright. "What? Are you certain?" "Of course he was— Oh, actually, Mr. Molesley didn't say. Miss Crawley's had a telegram. I suppose it could be that he's wounded or captured, now that you mention it." Carson levered himself out of bed, a vision in pink-striped pajamas, and Thomas averted his eyes as he reached for his dressing gown. "His lordship will have to be told." "Yes," Thomas said. "That's why Mr. Molesley telephoned. And he thinks it might be best for Miss Crawley to have another lady with her. Only when you wake them, please remind them there's a lot of people sleeping on the ground floor." Carson glared, eyebrows drawn together. "It won't help to have a lot of strangers wandering about asking what's going on," Thomas pointed out. Going back downstairs, he wanted to retreat to his office, but decided he had better stay by the telephone, at least until somebody else came down. He couldn't think of any particular reason for Molesley to ring back, but that didn't mean he wouldn't. So Thomas was standing there in the front hall when his lordship came down, also in pajamas and dressing gown. "Is it true?" he demanded. "No, I just thought it would be funny to wake everyone up." "Mr. Molesley rang and said that Miss Crawley'd had a telegram from the War Office, sir," he said. "That's all I know." Yes, of course. He didn't say whether—" "No, sir. Unfortunately, I didn't think to ask." By now the ladies were starting to come down the stairs as well, in their nightgowns and dressing gowns, so Thomas quickly explained the instructions he'd left about taking a message from the hospital to Crawley House, and withdrew. Unsurprisingly, the servants were similarly gathered on the landing behind the baize door. Carson would have had to wake at least one of them, Miss Hughes or O'Brien, to go into the bedroom shared by Lord and Lady Grantham and wake them. And once the two of them were up, everybody else would be due. "What's happened?" someone asked. "Is he dead?" someone else added. "What about William?" That was Daisy. Thomas looked at her sharply. He hadn't thought of that. "I don't know," he said, answering all of them. All I know is what Mr. Molesley said, that she's had a telegram. From the War Office? Daisy asked. Obviously. Thomas's declaration of ignorance, of course, did not stop them from peppering him with questions, and after saying, I don't know, a few more times, he decided to go to his office. That meant crossing the main hall, though, and before he was halfway across, Colonel Grantham said, Sergeant? Damn. Sir? Go and tell Branson to bring the car around, please, he said. He held up one hand. I realize I shouldn't ask you, but I don't want to wait for one of the others to get dressed. Yes, sir, Thomas said. His lordship was probably wise not to introduce any further delay into the process, because waking Branson required quite a lot of pounding on the carriage house door. He was contemplating getting some gravel from the drive to toss at what he took to be the bedroom window, when a different window banged open and Branson's head emerged. What? He demanded. They need the car, Thomas shouted up to him. Branson looked about as happy as Thomas would be to be awoken in the middle of the night because the family wanted to go for a drive, so he added, It's an emergency. Branson banged the window shut again, and a few moments later emerged from the front door, buttoning his shirt. What kind of emergency? So Thomas explained again about the telegram. About halfway through his explanation, Branson retreated inside, gesturing for Thomas to follow him. By the time he'd concluded with, I don't know what it said, whether he's dead or something else, Branson had finished with his shirt, pulled on one of those stupid knee boots they made him wear, and was working on the other. If nobody's dying this minute, I'd better get me coat and tie, Branson decided. He bounded up the stairs, returning a moment later with his jacket on, knotting his tie around his neck as he went. Did they say which car? He asks. Or who's going to where? No, Tom said. To Miss Crowley's house, I should think. Or perhaps you're fetching her here. Back at the house, Prentice was dealing with a number of patients who, woken either by the telephone or the hubbub in the hall, or increasingly by their fellow patients who'd been woken by one of the former, now needed something before they could go back to sleep. By the time they were all settled down again, some of the family had left, and the rest decamped to the small library where Thomas could not intrude. He went downstairs instead and found most of the others gathered in the servants' hall, still in their nightclothes. Only Carson and Anna were absent. Any news? He asked. No, said Miss Hughes. But here, have a cup of tea, she added, pouring one. Most of the women, even O'Brien, were gathered around Daisy, comforting her. Thomas, for lack of a better option, sat with Bates. He considered pointing out that there was no particular reason to think that whatever had happened to Mr. Matthew had also happened to William, but it seemed like one of those things that would make them all glare at him and say, Thomas! Even though it was both true and relatively comforting, while the things the women were saying to her met only at most one of those qualifications. A little while later, Anna joined the flock of women, reporting, Lady Edith says she'll drive up to Mr. Mason's in the morning and find out if he's had a telegram too. Good, Daisy said. He shouldn't be alone if he has. For perhaps another quarter of an hour, they chewed over what little information they had, which consisted mostly of listing the reasons the War Office might send a telegram, and giving examples of people they knew who had gotten telegrams for reasons other than that the person was dead. A typical example went something like, my sister's neighbor's cousin's butcher's wife got one in the middle of the night. She nearly died of fright, but her boy had only been wounded. He's home safe and sound now. Well, not sound, perhaps. He's lost both his legs, but he's alive, and isn't that the main thing? I got one, Thomas thought, and it said that Peter was dead. Missing and presumed, they called it. Finally, Branson came in. I thought you'd all like to know. He's not dead. After the cries of joy and sighs of relief, he went on, Gravely wounded is what the telegram said. They're sending him to our hospital here. What does that mean? Miss Patmore asked. Gravely wounded. That's what it said, Branson said, glancing over at Thomas. It means what it sounds like, Thomas said. Well, yes, Miss Patmore said. But missing limbs are... Does it mean he's about to go in a grave or what? I don't know. It came out sharper than Thomas intended, and he sighed. That they're sending him here means whatever it is, they don't think moving him will make it worse. He hoped he didn't have to spell out for them that there were two ways that could be the case. Either he was in stable condition, or he was expected to die no matter what. That they'd arranged to send him to the hospital where his mother was ward sister specifically made Thomas suspect the latter, but it could also be a perk of his being the presumed future Earl of Grantham. Glances went around the table. Branson added, Anna, Lady Mary and Lady Sybil are stopping the night at Miss Crowley's house. They said they have what they need for now. They'll send word in the morning if they want you to take them anything. Anna nodded, and he continued to Mr. Bates. His lordship has come back, so he can start telephoning to the War Office in the morning. He didn't say whether he was going back to bed or not.
The rest of us should, Miss Hughes said, standing up. Daisy, whatever news may come, you'll face it better for having a bit of rest.
So the rest of them wandered off to bed, and Thomas retreated to his office after telling Prentice the news. Lying down on the stretcher bed, he allowed himself to think that, with this happening, the last thing Rollins would want to do was get Thomas in trouble and add to Sister Crawley's burdens.
It's terrible about Sister Crawley's son,
Corporal Rollins said.
Yes, it is,
Anna agreed. She knew that wasn't what he'd come to talk about, though. If it was, he could have said it in the servants' hall instead of asking her if they could talk and dragging her outside.
Has there been any more news about his condition?
Corporal Rollins shook his head.
He'll be with the convoy that's coming tomorrow, but they don't tell us anything about what kind of shape they're in.
He hesitated.
It's unlikely to be good, given what was said in the telegram.
Thomas said the same,
Anna said, and watched Corporal Rollins's jaw tighten at the sound of his friend's name. Glancing at her out of the corner of his eye, Corporal Rollins said,
I suppose it's true, what he told me. Hardly the sort of thing a chap would say if it wasn't.
I don't know what precisely he told you,
Anna pointed out.
But yes, probably.
She wouldn't entirely put it past Thomas to have made up some other scandalous secret, but she didn't think it was likely either.
About him being not normal,
Corporal Rollins said.
And his brother Fitzroy.
They weren't actually related,
Anna said, wondering if Thomas might have left him with the impression he was engaging in incest along with the rest of it.
Yes,
Corporal Rollins said flatly.
That.
For a long moment, neither of them said anything. For an instant, Anna wished she smoked. It always seemed to give Thomas something to do during uncomfortable moments. Finally, she said what she knew Thomas would ask about if he found out Anna had talked to Rollins about him.
I hope you aren't going to make trouble for him. Miss O'Brien only brought it up to make trouble for him, and he doesn't deserve it.
He hadn't, even when he was being nothing but nasty to everyone, and he certainly didn't now.
No,
Corporal Rollins said.
No, I wouldn't do that. It's just a bit of a shock.
He looked away, reaching for his pocket. Then,
Sorry, do you mind if I smoke?
Go ahead,
she said. Corporal Rollins took out a pipe and began the process of filling and tamping it. As a thing to do with your hands in an awkward moment, it seemed even better than cigarettes, but Anna had never seen him smoke a pipe before. Pipe finally lit and puffing away at it, Corporal Rollins said,
I don't suppose he thought...
He shook his head.
I mean, he couldn't have.
Guessing what he meant, Anna said,
He knew you weren't like that.
He didn't need to know that the rest of them had thought he might be.
Good, he said, because I don't... I mean,
He cut himself off.
Wrong thing to be talking about with a lady.
I'm not exactly a lady,
Anna pointed out.
You know what I mean,
he said, and she did. He went on.
And I suppose he and that Ethel person weren't...
No! Anna had wondered if Thomas even realized that it could look that way to someone who didn't know about him.
I think he's taken an interest because of how he was born.
That, an experience of being treated shabbily by men above his station, but that was another thing that didn't need saying.
But there's no question of him being responsible in an ordinary sense.
Oh, I didn't think that,
Corporal Rollins said quickly.
I'm sure he'd have married her if there was any chance.
He stopped frowning.
Well, I was sure, but I suppose I don't know him as well as I thought I did.
I think you know him as well as anyone,
Anna said.
It's sort of an accident that the rest of us know about that. I mean, he didn't tell us.
Corporal Rollins didn't say anything to that, and after a moment she went on.
And I expect you're right that if he was, he would have. He was ready to make Private Griffiths marry her if there was any chance he was.
Corporal Rollins made a bugging sort of laugh.
You know, I always sort of liked that he wasn't as coarse about girls as some of the other chaps could be. In France, I mean.
Now it was Anna's turn not to know what to say. Of course, it would be obvious to him now why Thomas hadn't been.
You really all knew?
He asked skeptically. And you don't mind? Anna considered explaining that most of them didn't mind, but it didn't seem wise to draw Corporal Rawlins's attention to those that did. Instead, she said, "It's made his life very difficult in some ways. It isn't something he'd choose." No, no, I suppose he wouldn't. He stood up. If you don't mind, I think I'll walk for a bit. I have some things to think about. Of course, Anna said. As she went back inside and took up her sewing, she hoped Corporal Rawlins's thoughts would lead him to the right conclusion. Did anyone tell you about that chap that used to work here? Rollins was standing by the linen shelves a few yards from Thomas's desk. It might as well have been miles. No, he said. I've been busy. He'd been hiding, is what he'd been doing. Anywhere upstairs, and he might run into Rollins, and anywhere downstairs, Anna or Miss Hughes. His office was the only safe place, except that now Rollins was here. He was wounded too, Rollins said. Pretty badly, it sounds like. They were talking about it downstairs, he added in explanation. That's a shame, Thomas said cautiously. If yesterday hadn't happened, he might have said, I'm not glad to hear it, even though I never liked him. He's being sent to the big hospital in Leeds, but they want to bring him here, Rollins continued. Wonder how Major Clarkson will get out of that, you might have said. Yeah, apparently the old lady has taken an interest. The Dowager Countess, Thomas said. That answered that question. Clarkson wouldn't be getting out of it. She goes in for that noblesse oblique shit sometimes. He didn't say. Right, Rollins said, shifting a little from one foot to the other. I'll just let you get back to it then. Right, Thomas echoed. After Rollins had left, he lit a cigarette and tried to convince himself that what had just happened was a good thing. It was, really. It wasn't at all likely Rollins would go from filling him in on house gossip to denouncing him to Major Clarkson, or even to the rest of the lads. And it wasn't something he had to tell Thomas about, strictly speaking, for their jobs. They were going to be cordial, that's what Rollins was saying. It certainly beat the alternative. Anna was a little surprised when Corporal Rollins joined them again for dinner that night. She supposed they all were, though no one remarked on it. He sat beside Anna in Bates's usual place, so that she was between him and Thomas. They spoke to one another just enough to make plain that they weren't ignoring one another, but there was, needless to say, none of the usual teasing and shoving and arm-punching. Any time Anna happened to look Miss O'Brien's way, she was wearing a slight self-satisfied smirk. Thomas and Corporal Rollins falling out would have been enough on its own to cast the pall, but with the news of William and Mr. Matthew on top of it, the atmosphere was downright dismal. Everyone spoke in hushed tones, and the only topic apart from work was William and Mr. Matthew. And there wasn't very much to say about them, since the last real news about the Dowager Countess's determination to bring William to the village had come in mid-afternoon, and had thus had time to make it the whole way around the house twice. It was a relief, really, when the meal finally ended. Corporal Rollins left almost as soon as Mr. Carson and Miss Hughes had gone out, saying, Right, let's get back to it. Thomas stayed, lighting a cigarette, as soon as Miss O'Brien had left. He's on call tonight, he said abruptly. What? That's why he's here. Oh, Corporal Rollins, he meant. I see. Yeah. If he'd gone to the courtyard to smoke, Anna would have gone with him and tried to talk to him about things. But in here, even with Miss O'Brien gone, there was no hope of that. Perhaps that was why he hadn't gone outside. After a moment, he said, Whatever happened with Ethel? So much had happened since yesterday morning that Anna had nearly forgotten about Ethel's return. She'd only caught sight of her briefly as she'd been leaving, and Miss Hughes had given her only the barest outline of the story. She went with Miss Crawley, she said. Back to the... Thomas glanced down the table where some of the maids in the hallway were sitting. Place? To Crawley House for now, I think. One thing Miss Hughes had said was that Ethel was adamant about not giving up the baby. I think Miss Crawley means to keep us trying to persuade her. Or meant to, she added. Miss Crawley doubtless had other things on her mind now. I don't know what will happen now. Long as she doesn't turn up here again in the middle of the night, Thomas said. Daft cow. Anna decided to ignore that. Are you all right? She asked. Sure, he said unconvincingly. Why wouldn't I be? He stood up, stubbing his cigarette out as he did so. I'm off to bed. Anything happens in the small hours tonight, I'd just as soon find out in the morning. They did, for a change, manage to get through the night without any further surprises, though one did come that afternoon when an ambulance pulled up in front of the house and disgorged William, laid out on a stretcher and looking half dead. The ambulance was accompanied by one of the family cars, driven by Lady Edith and carrying the Dowager and an old gaffer Thomas supposed must be William's dad, so clearly its arrival wasn't a surprise to everyone. But why no one had thought the wardmaster of the convalescent home ought to know about a new patient, Thomas put aside as a question for a later date. The ambulance men, at Lady Edith's direction, carried William upstairs and installed him in one of the bedrooms set aside for family guests. Thomas managed to catch them on their way back down and get a précis of William's condition, about as grim as expected. He'd been blown up, caught by the edges of a shell strike that was, and thrown into the air. A bloke could walk away from one of those, but depending on how he landed, could end up with massive internal injuries. William was bleeding into his lungs, and it was only a matter of time until he drowned in his own blood.
Surprised they sent him back to Blighty, really,
the corporal from the ambulance said. He glanced up the grand staircase they'd just come down.
Unless he's somebody.
Hardly, Thomas said. Somebody's servant, that's all. Lady Edith came down the stairs about then, and the ambulance men made themselves scarce. Sergeant, she said, we've put William in the primrose room. Yes, my lady, Thomas said, because he had to. I do wish someone had thought to inform me he was coming. We aren't really set up for a death watch here. He wasn't sure whether to be disappointed or impressed that she didn't flinch at the unvarnished description of what was taking place. It won't add to your workload, she said. Lady Sybil and I will look after him. Thomas considered whether he could get away with pointing out that Nurse Crawley had other duties to attend to. Duties that someone else would have to undertake if she chose to attend to William instead, or that she'd already skipped off that morning to be at the hospital with Lady Mary when Captain Crawley arrived. Reluctantly, he concluded that he could not. Very good of you, my lady. She smiled tightly. In any case, it won't be for more than 2 or 3 days. I hope it isn't a problem if we borrow what we need from the convalescent home supplies. We'll keep track of anything that's used up so we can reimburse the army for it.
Blimey, Major Clarkson must have said a mouthful on the irregularity of the situation.
Yes, my lady. Nurse Crawley knows where everything is. He hesitated. We have to be especially careful in accounting for the stronger drugs, the ones kept in the locked cabinet. Some of the officers resisted going off morphine as they recovered, and orders from on high were becoming increasingly firm on the subject of not giving it to them. It would be best if we had some orders from Major Clarkson before whatever they gave him for the journey was off. Thomas hoped she'd take the hint that he didn't want to be the one asking for those orders, not when all signs pointed to the Major already being in a lather. She nodded. I see. Yes, I'll speak to him. Thomas expected that the edge would have gone off Major Clarkson's anger by the time afternoon rounds came along, but it turned out he'd misread the situation. Lady Edith buttonholed the Major as soon as he arrived, and while they were standing too far away from Thomas for him to hear what was being said, he saw Major Clarkson's back get stiffer and stiffer as the conversation went on. They parted with Lady Edith saying something sharp and sweeping off. It was plain enough that Major Clarkson had just been handed some shit and Thomas was standing directly downhill. Sergeant! He barked. Thomas presented himself. At what point? The Major said tightly. Did you plan to inform me that Private Mason had been brought here against my orders? Sir, Thomas said, stalling for time. He knew perfectly well that Major Clarkson was not looking for an answer or interested in hearing him defend himself, but he'd be damned before he'd take the blame for something he'd had nothing to do with. I didn't know anything about it until Lady Edith arrived with the ambulance. And why didn't you? Clarkson demanded. Because it's the bloody house and they don't ask me before they decide what they're going to do with it. Sir, Major Clarkson huffed and shook his head. I don't suppose it occurred to them that either of us might have a reason to know? Yes, sir. He seemed to have worked out that Thomas was not the one he ought to be angry at, so Thomas ventured, I formed the impression from what Lady Edith said that he'd been brought here over your objections, but I didn't realize it was also without your knowledge, sir. Why should they? Major Clarkson asked bitterly. Lady Edith is going to nurse him. I'm sure she'll know just what to do when he begins coughing up blood or raving or evacuate his bowels. Thomas hesitated over whether to tell him or not, but since this had started with him getting a bollocking for not keeping the Major informed, he said, I gather she's anticipating Nurse Crawley's assistance with the difficult bits. He scoffed. Of course she is. He gave Thomas an apologetic look. You'll have to manage, you know that. Yes, sir. Shouldn't be more than a couple of days. Clarkson sighed. I do feel for the boy, of course, and his father, but they're far from being the only family in the same situation. Yes, sir. All right, I suppose we'll start with him, and then come back down and go through the wards as usual. William looked small, lying in the big brass bed of the primrose room. There was barely a mark on him, just the sort of bumps and scrapes a kid could pick up in the schoolyard. But Thomas could hear from across the room how bad his breathing was. What was really hard to take, though, was the way the old gaffer Mr. Mason watched their every move as they sat him up so that Major Clarkson could listen with his stethoscope and then smooth the blankets over him after. Thomas, for reasons he couldn't name, suddenly remembered the wardmaster holding a cigarette to his lips when he'd been lying in the ward at the 47th.
Is so good, is it, sir?
Mr. Mason asked. No, Major Clarkson said gently. I'm afraid he is not. Mason breathed in hard through his nose.
I heard the ambulanceman say.
Here he glanced over at Thomas.
I don't think they meant for me to hear, so don't think badly of him. They said he were gonna.
Major Clarkson pressed his lips together. I'm sorry you heard it in that way, and even sorrier that
they were right,
Mr. Mason said. We'll keep him as comfortable as we can. Major Clarkson said and gave some orders regarding morphine and other things which Thomas wrote down on the chart and held for him to sign. Lady Edith met them in the corridor outside the room, and Major Clarkson repeated his instructions in less technical form. She nodded alertly after each one. When he'd finished, she asked, Do you have any idea how long?
Days,
Major Clarkson said,
and not very many of them.
His father wasn't sure if he should go back to the farm tonight and return in the morning, or...
She trailed off.
There's stock that needs tending to, apparently.
Major Clarkson nodded.
I can't be certain, of course, but I'd wager on him lasting the night. Further than that, I won't venture to say.
As they went downstairs, Thomas asked,
Is there any news about Captain Crawley, sir?
The others were bound to interrogate him on that subject, as well as about William at dinner. And the more he had to say about it, the less opportunity anyone would have to ask him about anything else. His prediction proved correct. The mood around the dinner table was, oddly enough, less grim than the night before, despite the deathbed upstairs. Perhaps because there was at least new information to talk about.
He came on the convoy this afternoon and doesn't seem any worse than they expected,
Thomas reported once they'd all sat down. Rollins now 2 places away from him beyond Anna and Bates.
He isn't conscious, but they gave them a great deal of pain medication when they transport them, so that isn't alarming. And that'll be the same for William,
he added to Daisy.
I wouldn't expect either of them to come round before morning.
Anna spoke up.
Lady Mary said that the card thingy they put on Mr. Matthews said probable spinal damage.
That was what Major Clarkson had said, and Thomas nodded.
There isn't much room for details on the telecards, and they haven't taken x-rays yet. But what does it mean? Probable spinal damage?
Miss Patmore asked. She and Daisy had finished bringing out the food, but lingered for the news.
Is he paralyzed? That's just what they're not sure of, Thomas said. And if he is, whether it's permanent or not. I'd have thought, O'Brien said, that Dr. Clarkson would do everything he could to answer the questions. Her ladyship and his lordship being such supporters of the hospital. That, Thomas said, is because you know nothing. Anna turned a wide-eyed glance on him, which Thomas ignored. In Captain Crawley's case, a complete diagnosis wouldn't make a difference in his care, at this stage at least. If the spine's broken, it'll stay broken, and if it's just bruised, it'll get better. Either way, the only thing to do right now is keep him comfortable. He's right, Rollins said, not looking at Thomas. Of course his people want to know what's going to happen, but knowing won't change the outcome. The medical officers can only do so much in a day, and they have to start with the cases where there's something to be done, or a decision to be made, that might affect whether the chap pulls through or not, or whether he's crippled or not.
Well then, said Miss Hughes, I'm sure Mr. Matthew wouldn't want to be given priority over others who need the doctor's care more than he does.
With a repressive look at O'Brien, she added,
No more than his lordship and her ladyship would want it for him.
Thomas thought he was probably right about Captain Crawley. He was an all-right sort, but was less sure about the rest of them. But when they get to the less urgent cases, he'll be at the head of that queue, I'm sure, him being who he is. That's what he should, Carson declared as though Thomas had implied otherwise. After the meal, Rollins excused himself immediately, as he'd done yesterday, and Thomas lingered, as he'd done yesterday. Unfortunately, it didn't seem that her ladyship was making an early night of it tonight, so Miss O'Brien stayed, too. Thomas wanted a smoke, but if he went outside, someone was sure to follow him, and up in his office, Rollins would be getting settled in for the night. He sat and tried not to fidget. In the circumstances, Daisy coming and sitting by him was almost a welcome distraction. "You seen him, then?" she asked, adding, "William?" as if he might not have known who she meant. "Haven't you?" She shook her head. "How does he look?" Wishing even more ardently for a cigarette, Thomas said, "He looks a lot better than he is. Pale and a bit banged up, but nothing to frighten you away." "It isn't that," she said. "His father's there." She looked at Thomas as if he ought to understand the significance of this. "So?" "William will have told him we're engaged," she said. Thomas stared at her. She was still on about that. "You do understand," he said carefully, "that he's going to die within the next few days." "That's just it," she said. "I can't lie to him on his deathbed, or to his old dad." "What, you're going to jilt him on his deathbed instead?" "Of course not." "Why not? What's the other option?" Thomas asked. "Just avoid him until he dies?" The guilty look on Daisy's face suggested she had been planning precisely that. "You won't get away with it," he said. "Major Clarkson expects him to last at least a day or two." "Then what should I do?" She was asking him. "Lie to him on his deathbed," Thomas said. "Think up some things to say that you can make sound convincing. Put in as much truth as you can. You do like him, don't you?" "Yes," she said. "Just not that way." "Right, so there's got to be stuff you can say that isn't a lie, even if he hears it a different way than you mean it." Looking thoughtful, Daisy nodded. "What about his dad? What do I say to him?" How in God's name would Thomas know what a father wanted to hear from his dying son's fiancée? It wasn't as though Peter's family would have wanted to hear anything at all from him. Although if they did, it would be almost a mirror image of Daisy's situation. He'd have had to pretend they'd only been friends, while Daisy was going to have to pretend she'd been in love. "Talk about what you like about William, what you'll remember about him. Just leave out the bits it won't do any good for him to hear." About the time Miss Patmore started screeching for Daisy to get back in the kitchen, the bells rang for O'Brien and Bates, as Thomas was finally lighting up a cigarette. Anna came and sat by him. "That was good advice, what you said to Daisy." "Don't you stop," Thomas said wearily. "No, I mean it," she said. "Sometimes telling the whole truth isn't the best thing." "I really didn't have a choice," he snapped, glancing at the place O'Brien had so recently vacated. She sighed. "I wasn't talking about that." "Sure you weren't." Really, she might not have been, but Thomas was getting very tired of being nice. She pressed her lips together. "But speaking of that, we talked the other day. He isn't going to do anything." He was probably meant to be grateful she talked him out of it, or that she'd gone to the trouble of finding out, or whatever it was she'd done. He felt more like telling her not to bother meddling in his life, but reigned in the impulse. Figured. The next day brought no new crises, thankfully, but plenty of new things to be irritated about. As expected, Nurse Crawley was running off every other minute to help one or the other of her sisters with something related to William or Captain Crawley. The latter was even more irritating than the former because Captain Crawley was an official patient at the hospital, which had plenty of nurses of its own, not to mention Captain Crawley's actual mum. So there was no reason at all for Thomas to be rearranging the duty assignments a dozen times before lunch. But he couldn't say anything to her about it, of course, and when he tried grousing to some of the others, they looked at him like he'd grown another head. Everyone liked Nurse Crawley. As if that weren't enough, Major Bryant, of all people, turned up around lunchtime. He was on his way back to France now, after having been on a training course since leaving the convalescent home, and had decided to stop in for a visit with his old pals. No one had seen fit to tell Thomas about that either, although he gathered Lady Grantham and Lady Edith had known. Not that there was anything in particular they had to do. Miss Patmore's lunches for the patients were always the sort of thing that could easily stretch to feed an unexpected guest. But Thomas would have put aside some time for glaring at him in an unfriendly manner, which now had to be fitted into whatever spare moments he could find. At least Miss Hughes also seemed to be on the job. When they were clearing the lunch, Thomas saw her making her way toward the Major with a steely glint in her eye. And then, when Thomas poked his head into the kitchen after making his afternoon check on the sink room, Daisy practically fell on him, banging on about William and getting married and something to do with the Dowager Countess. He'd only looked in there in hopes of getting something to eat. His appetite always seemed to flee him when he was sitting down to a meal, and now he earnestly wished he hadn't. Equally earnestly, he wished someone would come running to inform him of some emergency requiring the War Master's immediate attention, but when none occurred, he sighed inwardly and herded Daisy into the courtyard, where he could at least have a smoke while she explained whatever it was she wanted. "All right," he said, once they were seated. "What's this about marrying William?"
"He wants me to marry him."
That wasn't news. Thomas waited.
"No!" she clarified. "Before he, dies. So I'll be his widow and get a pension from the government."
Looked at from every angle Thomas could devise, this did not seem like a problem. William was going to die. He knew he was going to die. As a widow, she'd be perfectly free to marry somebody else if she wanted, and he was in no shape to consummate the marriage if that was what she was worried about. Though now that he thought about it, "He can't," Thomas pointed out. "He isn't going to live long enough for the banns to be read." He had a vague idea there were ways around that, but William was in no shape to be running off to Gretna Green either.
"That's just it," Daisy wailed. "The Dowager was going to make the vicar do it."
Oh, well, then it had to be the consummation she was carrying on about, didn't it? "Look, if you're worried about there isn't going to be a wedding night, use it well enough."
Daisy stared at him. "I didn't even think about that."
She looked over her shoulder toward the kitchen.
"Do they all know that he used it well enough? Do they think that I'm going to—"
"I have no idea. This is the first I'm hearing of any of this." "Then what is it exactly that's the problem?"
"I can't. Not when I don't love him like that. It was bad enough lying to him. I can't lie to God."
Would she really have to? Thomas tried to remember what the vows actually said. For as long as you both shall live, no problem there when one of them was going to be dead in a day or two. Forsaking all others, also not a problem. The bit about sickness and health was a bit of a joke in the circumstances, but William had the sickness part covered and Daisy the health. For richer, for poorer was pretty much the point of the exercise, and it occurred to Thomas that precisely what Daisy was objecting to would have fixed everything for Ethel a few weeks ago. Ethel would probably kill to be a respectable widow with a pension. For that matter, Thomas wouldn't have sneezed at it either. He thought about Peter's post office account put into Thomas's name so that he'd have it if what had happened did. It was, Thomas thought, brutally unfair. Perhaps not as bad as when William had turned up safe and well back from the dead, but Thomas would give a lot to have seen Peter one last time before he died. He'd have given even more to face that moment, having just told the world what they were to each other. Suddenly, he ran out of patience for Daisy's dithering. "You know what?" he said. "Marry him or don't. I don't care." Daisy drew back startled. But no," Thomas said. "You didn't. Because if you've thought about it, you've realized I'm the last person in the world, or second last counting Ethel, who's going to sympathize with you. You get to be William's widow. Peter doesn't even have a fucking grave."
"But that's—"
She broke off.
"I'm sorry."
"Sure," he said, taking a quick drag from his cigarette. "Go away."
"I didn't mean to—"
"Fine, go." She went. "Miss Hughes, the very last thing I'd wish to be is rude," Major Bryant said. "But in this case, I really must be left to my own devices." Damn and blast the man. When she'd heard of his visit, Miss Hughes had decided, against her better judgment, to try one more time to accept his responsibilities. Now that Ethel was, no longer settled, it seemed even more urgent, and she did have some slight hope that the news that he had a son would make a difference. It oughtn't, but men did often feel differently about sons than they did about daughters, and that was a fact. No sooner had she returned downstairs than Daisy came hurrying in from the courtyard. Oh, Miss Hughes, she said, looking relieved at the sight of her. Thomas is upset. Before Miss Hughes could ask for further clarification, the girl was hurrying off toward the kitchen. Upset in regards to Thomas could mean almost anything. Peering out a window, she was relieved to see him sitting on a crate near the door, smoking and occasionally swiping angrily at his eyes. Deciding to give him a moment to compose himself, she checked on a few things and then stepped outside. Thomas, in the act of lighting another cigarette, flinched at the sound of the door opening and looked up at her balefully. I suppose, he said flatly, Daisy went running to tell you I swallowed her. No, she said, coming down the steps and gingerly taking a seat on another crate. She said you were upset. He scoffed and looked away. I don't suppose you'd like to tell me what's bothering you. Oh, nothing, he said with patently false breeziness. What on earth could I possibly be bothered about? She ignored the sarcasm and said calmly, Quite a few things, I should imagine. He hunched his shoulders. Well, one of them anyway. She waited. He smoked. She waited some more. It isn't that I'm not sorry William's going to die. It's just... He shook his head. I don't know. Clearly abandoning whatever point he'd been struggling to make, he continued. But I don't think I should be the one who has to listen to Daisy carry on about how she doesn't want to marry William. That's all. Miss Hughes felt her eyebrows rise. She doesn't. No, she's not in love with him. He wasn't sure either why Daisy would choose Thomas as the confidant on that subject. Unless perhaps she was like him, but no, that didn't seem likely at all, not when Daisy had fancied herself in love with Thomas before the war. I don't see that it makes much difference at this point, she said. Not when the poor boy's halfway to the grave. That's what I said. Only she's carrying on about lying to God and all kinds of daft stuff. The girl could be a bit too impressed with her own scruples, that much was certain. Well, if she feels that way, she ought to have said something sooner, but I don't see how she can refuse now, especially not after the Dowager has gone to so much trouble over it. Thomas snorted. Because she'd have been doing something much more valuable with her time if she hadn't. That bit of lèse-majesté was best ignored as well. Thomas only said things like that to provoke a reaction. She continued, I'm sure there are plenty of others who would be grateful for the chance to marry their sweetheart, even on his deathbed. She wondered, in fact, if something like that might have been at the root of Thomas's upset. If it was, he wasn't telling her. Or marry anybody, he'd said. If he'd come home to die a few weeks earlier, I'd have said to see if he'd take Ethel instead, but it's too late for that. That boy's mind works in the strangest ways, she thought once she'd untangled what they meant. She could, with an effort, see the logic. A deceased husband would give Ethel's situation a veneer of respectability. If one supposed that William was simply eager to marry, and not to marry Daisy specifically, it would be a solution. Except that no one would marry with no regard to whom they were marrying, even in a marriage of convenience. Each of the couple had some requirements. Not that I wish to encourage this line of thinking, but what do you mean about it being too late? He glanced at her. He'd be the baby's father if she married before it was born. Not really, she pointed out, realizing only when she said it that it might be tactless given his circumstances. Legally, yeah. That's how it works. She did not have to ask how he knew. Widow with a war orphan. Bound to be good for something. But now it's been born, it'll be a bastard even if she married the actual father, so... He shrugged. No point trying to talk him into it. There really wouldn't have been in any case, but she was glad she didn't have to talk him out of trying. Corporal Rollins, Mr. Carson said, stepping out of his office just as Rollins had been about to go up the stairs to the orderly's room after dinner. I wonder if I might have a word. He'd spoken to Rollins a few times before about convalescent home matters, which he always only relayed to Barrow anyway. Barrow had said Carson did it because he disliked Barrow. This time he rather wished Mr. Carson would just tell Barrow whatever it was directly, because Barrow was barely speaking to him, which was a little rich in Rollins' opinion, given that Barrow was the one with the problem. But he supposed that explaining that would be more time and trouble than just listening to whatever it was. If it wasn't urgent, he could write Barrow a note. Yes, as long as it's quick, he said. I meant to be on duty. Of course. He gestured for Rollins to go into his office, and once they were seated, said,
I shan't beat around the bush. I gather that you've been made aware of certain unsavory things regarding Sergeant Barrow.
Oh, God. Could he possibly claim that he was suddenly too busy to have this conversation after all? Not really, he concluded reluctantly. Yes, that is, if you're referring to what I think you are.
Yes, well, I hope you understand that any scandal involving him cannot but also involve this house and Lord and Lady Grantham. I'm sure you'll agree that that would be a 4 times further opening their home to the wounded officers.
Rollins hadn't really thought of it that way, but he grasped what Mr. Carson was hinting at. I don't mean to, he borrowed Anna's phrasing, make trouble for him, if that's what you're saying.
Good. Apart from the many innocent parties who would be affected by any unpleasantness, causing a furor would only draw more attention to matters better left unexamined.
Yes, sir, Rollins said. I quite agree. If only Miss O'Brien had left things alone, he'd been perfectly happy not knowing. Mr. Carson nodded.
I'm pleased to hear that,
he said.
It's quite natural and right that you should find this disclosure repellent, of course.
Repellent was a stronger word than Rollins would have chosen. Plenty of chaps at school and done things which Rollins didn't really see the point of, but the things they didn't really seem that much more undignified and off-putting than the ones that apparently constituted a normal married life. And while there was a substantial difference between doing those things and being one of those, he supposed Anna was right that Barrow wouldn't have chosen it. Distasteful, perhaps, he suggested.
It did.
He settled back in his chair, his tone taking a turn for the avuncular.
You see, I quite understand how shocking this must be. In my youth, when I was about your age, in fact, I learned a similar fact about a fellow I worked with and whom I had considered a friend.
Mr. Carson was frankly the last person he'd have thought to turn to for advice in this situation, or any other. He was widely disliked by all of the orderlies, but if he had in fact experienced the same thing, perhaps he'd have something useful to say. What did you do?
I immediately ceased working with him, went back into service, and refused his letters.
Mr. Carson said quite matter-of-factly. Really? Rollins was still trying to figure out some response when Mr. Carson continued.
Unfortunately, you cannot do the same, without, as I said, drawing undue attention to the matter. But in the circumstances, I think the course you are following is the right one. Keep him at arm's length, but avoid a public falling out, which would only raise questions about the cause.
Was that what it looked like he was doing? More to the point, was that what Barrow thought he was doing? R.C., he said for the sake of something to say. Mr. Carson went on.
I do blame myself, I'm sorry to say. I ought to have dismissed him from the house as soon as I became aware of his proclivities, but he'd been a good worker up until then. I suppose I didn't have the heart. I suppose that he would move on soon enough, as it was clear his sort weren't welcome here, but
He shrugged.
who can understand what goes on in the mind of someone like that?
Oh,
And now all of the women's staff seem to have adopted him as a sort of mascot.
yes, Rollins said, standing up hastily. But if that's all, I really shouldn't get back to my duties.
Of course, but if there should be any further concerns, I hope you will bring them to me.
Oh, yes, certainly, Rollins thought on his way up the stairs. I'll certainly come to you if I want another cozy chat about how repellent my best mate is. Then he stopped, in mid-stride, examining what he had just thought. Was Barrow still his best mate? If he was, Rollins was going to have to do something about it other than keeping him at arm's length. That was for sure.
Thomas wasn't sure who'd talked her into it or how, but by the time Victor Travis came to the house the next afternoon, Daisy was resigned to her role as war bride. Major Clarkson had made a special trip up to the house around mid-morning to look in on William and had pronounced that he didn't have long. The fluids have filled nearly 3/4 of his lungs, he had explained to Mr. Mason and Lady Edith while Thomas stood off to one side. At the rate they're accumulating, he is less than 24 hours before he'll no longer be able to get enough oxygen to survive. He may last the rest of the day, but I should be surprised if he saw the morning. Mr. Mason let out a sort of strangled gasp. Thomas knew what it felt like to make a sound like that. But that had been the morning. Now it was afternoon, and Anna and some of the other women had done their best to fix Daisy up,
putting her in a flowered blouse that looked like something Lady Edith had worn before the war, and putting her hair up in some sort of uneven bunches over her ears that reminded Thomas of a cocker spaniel. The maids all wore their black dresses, the ones they put on in the evenings. Without their white aprons on, the effect was funereal. They all went upstairs, even the new maid who'd just started that day, with Daisy on Carson's arm like he was father of the bride. And when they got there, the bed was garlanded with flowers, and most of the family was there. Christ, they really were committing to this farce, weren't they? The Dowager Countess was front and center, but the only one missing was Lady Mary, who was presumably down at the hospital with her own half-dead fiancé. Captain Crowley was apparently expected to live, but paralyzed. The vicar started to intone the marriage service, instituted by God in the time of man's innocence, and Thomas wished he'd not come. He didn't know why he had, really. He didn't work for the house, and none of the convalescent home staff were here. Perhaps he was here in case William started coughing up blood in the middle of his vows. That was probably it. Mr. Mason produced the ring with trembling fingers. Maybe that was what Thomas was here for, to chase it down when he dropped it. But the old gaffer managed to hand it to his son, who managed to put it on Daisy's finger without incident. Thomas wondered idly where they'd managed to get their hands on one in the village. He'd not heard of anyone running into York, at least. But then he realized it was probably William's dead mum's ring. Merciful Christ! Then it was done. They kissed, and Daisy stood by her husband's deathbed holding his hand, as everyone went to congratulate him and give her their best wishes. The family, first, of course, which left the rest of them standing around trying to figure out which of the things you normally said at a wedding could be gotten through with a straight face. That Daisy looked lovely seemed to be the consensus. And the flowers. Quite a bit was said about the flowers. Finally, it was Thomas's turn. "Congratulations," he told William. "Never thought I'd see the day." William breathed raspily. He stopped trying to answer people after Carson. "Right," Thomas said. Daisy?" He nodded to her and retreated. There wasn't a wedding breakfast. Considering they'd gone to some trouble over the rest of it, Thomas thought there might have been something, particularly as the wedding happened at about tea time, but perhaps Miss Patmore had been too busy browbeating the bride into participating in the ceremony. Dinner that night was pretty grim, too, both in terms of atmosphere and the food, which consisted of potatoes boiled too long and meat not boiled long enough. But at least chewing gave them all something to do, as nobody had very much to say. At least not until dinner was over. Once they'd all come to the conclusion there was to be no pudding, and started getting up to go about their business, Rollins, who deigned to sit next to him this time, said, "Can we talk?" Thomas wanted to say no, but he supposed it would have to be done sooner or later, and if he opted for later, he'd only be up all night wondering if what Rollins wanted to say was, "I've decided to have to tell Major Clarkson that you're a you-know-what." "My office," he said. This time of night they'd be undisturbed there. They went up. "Want a drink?" Thomas asked challengingly. God knew he wanted one, and why not make this a sort of parody of all the other times they talked in here? It couldn't possibly make it any worse. "All right," Rollins said wearily, sitting down in his usual spot. Thomas poured the cheap brandy. He wasn't wasting the last of the wardmaster's armagnac on this, and handed one to Rollins. "Cheers," Rollins echoed. He didn't say anything else, and after a while Thomas reminded him, "You said you wanted to talk." "Right," he said, taking another quick gulp of his drink. "Right, this thing about you." Thomas briefly considered the merits of pretending he had no idea what Rollins was talking about. "What about it?" "You know, a lot of chaps do things at school." If this was a pass, Thomas was going to kill him. "Not at council schools, they don't." "No, but what I mean is that it can be a sort of stage, can't it? When one starts having impulses and girls are still sort of mysterious, so... I mean, are you sure that you're really..." "I'd like a thought Thomas would have preferred the pass." "I'm 26, he said flatly. And my best mate's a girl. That's when he had left, anyway. He only realized that some part of him had hoped Rollins would say, "Thought I was your best mate," when Rollins didn't. He continued, "Pretty sure it's not a stage. Yeah, right," Rollins muttered. He took another swallow of his drink.
So, Fitzroy, you actually loved him? Like you're meant to love the girl you marry?
Yes. Rollins heaved a sigh.
Alright then.
What the hell did he mean by that?
What? I mean, it's fine. I don't suppose it's any of my business, really, but, if that's how it is, it's fine.
That really did not do much to clarify matters.
When you say it's fine, I mean, can we stop fighting now?
Oh, well, that was... I didn't realize we were. He lied. Rollins punched him in the shoulder. Hey now! Thomas shoved it back. You almost made me spill my drink. He downed it and got up. You want another one?
Yeah, all right,
Rollins said, holding out his glass. Well, finish that one first, Thomas said, and got out the other bottle. On her way to the servants' hall for breakfast, Anna saw Miss Hughes coming out of her sitting room, a slight smile on her face. Anna hesitated, wondering what on earth she could have found a smile about this morning. William had died at dawn, and Miss Patmore had spread the word to all the women when she'd put Daisy to bed, just as the rest of them were getting up. Miss Hughes, seeing her confusion, reversed course back into her sitting room, beckoning Anna to follow. She drew aside the curtain to her window and motioned for Anna to look out. Thomas and Corporal Rollins sat on their usual smoking crate, shoulder to shoulder. As she watched, Thomas laughed at something Corporal Rollins said. Miss Hughes let the curtain fall back, and they stepped away from the window.
It does my heart good to see something go well on a day like today, she said.
Yes, Anna agreed.
It certainly does.